The 20th meeting in 2025 of the Finance and Public Administration Committee. The first item on our agenda is an evidence session with the Scottish Fiscal Commission on their May 2025 economic and fiscal forecasts. I welcome to the meeting Professor Graham Roy, Chair, Professor Domenico Lombardi, Commissioner, Michael Davidson, Head of Social Security and Devolved Taxes, and John Ireland, Chief Executive, Scottish Fiscal Commission. Good morning, and I'd like to welcome you, Professor Roy, to have a brief opening statement.
And good morning, everyone, and thanks very much for inviting us to give evidence on our latest forecasts published last month. I thought it would be helpful, firstly, to outline the process for our forecast this time around. And you'll recall that in February, the Cabinet Secretary wrote to advise that the Scottish Government intended to publish its medium-term financial strategy on the 29th of May. We proceeded on that basis with the deadline for new data inclusion at the end of April and policy changes in early May. On the 6th of May, a day before our deadline for final policies, the Cabinet Secretary for Finance wrote saying that the Scottish Government were considering deferring publication of their MTFS until later in June. As I set out in my reply, to which you were copied, Convener, as all the necessary forecasting, analysis and engagement with the Government had taken place, it was my view that publishing the core economic, tax and social security forecast as planned on 29th of May would aid transparency and enable us to give evidence to this committee. I note that this was welcomed by the Cabinet Secretary in her reply to me on the 13th of May. As a result, our updated forecasts are based on current Scottish Government policy and information available at the time. We will publish an updated report alongside the MTFS on the 25th of June. On the detail of our report, we estimate that total funding available to the Scottish Government this year will be £59.6 billion, almost £800 million higher than in December when the budget was set. This is mostly because of more UK Government funding, but also because the Scottish Government is now expected to carry forward some money not spent last year. Despite this increase, pressures on the Scottish Government's budget remain significant. Two of the key significant Scottish public sector pay deals already agreed for this year have been above the Scottish Government's policy of 3%. This is likely to create further pressure for ongoing pay negotiations. The challenges in pay are added to by April's rise in employer national insurance contributions. Although the Scottish Government has had some extra funding, this only covers around half to two-thirds of the Scottish Government's estimated costs. And social security commitments are growing. We forecast spending on social security will now be £2 billion more than the associated funding by 2029-2030. A key reason for this larger gap is the proposed changes by the UK Government to tighten the qualifying criteria for PIP, which will reduce spending in England and Wales, thereby decreasing funding through the block grant adjustment by around £400 million in that year. Finally, we have a modest downward adjustment to our GDP forecast for this year, and clearly there remains significant uncertainty of the outlook for trade and the impact that any US tariffs may have on the global economy.
In terms of the medium-term financial strategy, you seem concerned about that. I thank you for your opening statement, but you do seem concerned about this delay. I can almost sense a level of irritability actually in talking about that. So I'm just wondering if you can tell us what impact that's had on the Scottish Fiscal Commission.
I think there's a couple of things. I think us setting out our forecasts and the tax and the economy forecast and social security, I think we've been working on the basis that would be ready to sit alongside the publication of the MTFS in May, and ideally you'd want all of that to come out at the same time. I think for us, given that we'd done all the work, or we'd done all the collaboration with the Government, we'd set our forecast, it made sense for us to publish when we said we were going to publish, in part because we would then, if we had delayed it until the end of June, we would then be sitting on forecasts that were essentially out of date, or a significant period of time had passed. And also, I think I'd given this a commitment to this committee when in December, when I think I was asked by the Deputy Convener, would we be publishing updated forecasts and would we be back? And I said that we would be. And if we had delayed to the end of June, then that wouldn't have given us a chance to come along and give evidence to the committee. What we'll do around when the MTFS is published is it will provide an update on any changes to funding to give information for this committee about the outlook. And then you'll recall we've also committed to publish in August our new regular fiscal update, which will do a deeper dive into what this might mean for the outlook for spending and funding And that hopefully will then provide useful information for the committee to then undertake its work in the run-up to the budget.
I mean, it wasn't the reason given by the Cabinet Secretary, as I recall, but David Phillip of the Institute of Fiscal Studies said it would be more appropriate to actually wait until the spending review, which is what the government has done. You know, that wasn't the entire reason I think she gave, but she did touch on it somewhat. But do you not think that that's an argument there?
I think, yeah, I mean, after the spending review, there'll be much more clarity around funding. So we'll get the Barnett consequentials tomorrow. That gives the government much greater or more certainty about the overall outlook for that. I guess there's a general point, I think, what we would say is that that we had made the commitment to publish, so we would follow through on that commitment. And there's always going to be uncertainties, there's always going to be nuances, there's always going to be changes in there. And I think the important thing for us is to come back and talk about some of the big picture stuff. So we mentioned about the changes in the net tax position, which I think are really important, changes in the social security funding position, changes in the outlook for the economy. And I think it's really important to be able to present and discuss all of that. And I think that's why, for us, transparency is really important.
As the Scottish Fiscal Commission does so well, you set out income tax, social security, forecasts over a number of years in some great detail. But obviously, in terms of the record of this committee, I'm just wondering if you can talk us through a wee bit both of those. First of all, let's look at income tax. I noticed that income tax projections are around 23% increase over the next 5 years or so. I'm just wondering if you can tell us how much of that increase will be down to fiscal drag and how much will be due to economic growth.
So it's a mixture of both. So one thing I would say is that we assume as we get further through later on in the projections that our baseline policy has the thresholds increasing in line with inflation. So that offsets some of the effects of fiscal drag coming through to it. So a large part of the majority of what it is that we are seeing in terms of the growth in income tax is largely just growth in earnings across the economy. There'll be fiscal drag. Whenever you have a progressive system, you'll get some fiscal drag. But it's not as though we're essentially assuming that everything is fiscal drag because we've frozen the thresholds. It just comes back.
What the difference was in terms of the share, if you like, of the growth of that, because obviously that's a concern. I mean, it's been a concern across the UK. It's not just a Scottish issue, of course. I mean, with both this UK government and the last one have, effectively allowed fiscal drag to increase, enhance their coffers, and the Scottish government's done the same. So I'm just looking to see how that.
I can give you. We can send you the breakdown on the specifics of that. I mean, I think that if you look at our in our supplementary figures, we talk about the costings for the tax policy changes, and I think we discussed this in December as well. If you actually look at where, from the policy change perspective, the freezing of the thresholds is where you actually raise significant amounts of revenue, so over £200 million from freezing of the higher rate threshold, and that largely comes through essentially the fact that you've got large number of taxpayers moving into that tax band. So fiscal drag ultimately is one of the key ways that government raises revenue over time, and the further you go into the future, then the more significant that becomes.
Now, in terms of social security, I mean, the projected rise over the next 5 years is 30%, which obviously is higher than the projected increase in tax revenues, and you've talked about that, in terms of the overall Scottish budget. But when one looks at the actual social justice portfolio, adult disability payments are expected to increase by more than 50% over that period. So there's some really quite concerning kind of figures if we look at it just from an economic point of view. I mean, year on year increase of 8-10%. So I'm just wondering if you can talk us through that a wee bit.
Again, there's a couple of things to separate out. So one of the key reasons why things like social security payments rise and they increase toward the end of the period is because of inflation. So we assume that essentially the payments are weighted by inflation. The important thing to note is that from a public finance point of view, that is offset by increases in the block grant adjustment, because that's essentially assuming the same happens at the UK rate. So it doesn't actually have a net impact on the budget. And it's quite interesting if you look at the figure 5.4 on page 58. What we were seeing in December was that essentially the net position once you got to 26, 27. So once you had the changes we were seeing in the delivery of Social Security payments, and also the introduction of the new payments like Scottish Child Payment and the like, essentially we were seeing a flattening off in the net tax position. So essentially, the reforms had been put in place, and then, okay, you'd have growth in the payments, but that was being offset by growth in the BGA. So essentially we were seeing no real change in the net tax position, the net Social Security funding position toward the end of the period. That's changed in the most recent update. So you'll see our May update actually shows that actually increasing towards 2 billion at the end of the forecast period. And that's largely because of the changes the UK government have proposed to do around qualification for PIP, which we know will impact on the BGA, and that's why that increases towards the end. And I think there's another good example. We started to see this when we spoke in December about the winter fuel payments, which I'm sure we might come on to, given recent announcements. But that was the first time we were starting to see the interconnections between Social Security and the net position in Scotland being driven not by decisions that were taken by the Scottish Government, but actually decisions that were taken by the UK Government. And that the fact that the net position is dependent on both government decisions, because it matters on the funding as well as the spending. And you see that in May, so that leads to an increase in the gap of about 400 million relative to where we were in December, and that's really becoming through the UK government's changing plans.
Yeah, you said overall, basically, the effect of Social Security spending is widened to 600 million, and as you said, a third of that is because of two-child cap being lifted here by the devolved government, and 400 million because of the UK government policy to reduce block grant adjustment funding. Now, in terms of the economy, I mean, your kind of projections look to me to be fairly, and I know you've been liaising with the OBR in this, but they look to be fairly optimistic. I mean, this morning's figures, as you'll have seen, unemployment has increased. There seems to be quite an impact from they say what was said in the news today was a combination of increase in the minimum wage and at the same time employer national insurance contributions. So I'm just wondering, what your view is.
Yeah. So maybe I'll give a broad overview, and then Domenico, you might want to come in on the specifics around tariffs. I mean, so overall, I think there's a lot of noise going on in the economy at the moment. So a lot of uncertainty that in itself will have an impact. But what we try and do is almost kind of see through some of that and look at what are the underlying trends in the economy. So tariffs are a really good example of that. There's a lot of discussion about tariffs, but we haven't really yet fully seen the full effects of that coming through. Similarly with effects like inflation, a slight increase relative to where we were, but the overall trend is pretty much on line with what we had forecast. So we've revised down slightly our forecast for this year based upon some of that uncertainty, but then think that it will bounce back a bit next year. So overall, we haven't really changed our forecast.
Well, yeah, I mean, I noticed that. I mean, he did put the tariffs in perspective, saying that the US trade with the US is only effectively 2% of the Scottish GDP. So I mean, but I think the concern is the impact is on specific sectors of the Scottish economy, and that is not just sectoral, but it'll obviously be geographic. If we're talking about, for example, the obvious one being whisky. So it was just to see whether or not that. I mean, you'll obviously be keeping a very close eye on this. But you talk about gross domestic product. 1.2% is now the projection for the year instead of the 1.6 you predicted in December. Do you still feel that that's likely to be the case? Because you've also said in paragraph 34 that you think there'll be broadly flat employment growth.
Yeah, I mean, I think 1.2% growth is relatively fragile. It's not that great growth. I mean, I guess the key for us is whether that is different asymmetrically from the rest of the UK, and that's broadly, I think, what we're seeing. I think the key thing is these numbers are always going to move around ever so slightly, and what we're seeing is two things. One is that the uncertainty itself is having an impact on growth ever so slightly. But we think that we need to be cautious about that, about over-egging it. Tariffs might have will have an impact on the economy, in the short run, but they need to be put in context about where actual growth comes from more generally in economic activity. Your point, though, the important caveat about that is the importance of some key sectors and what might be impacted by that. But at a macro level, it might be relatively limited in context to other shocks we've had in recent times. The second point, and probably the more important point, is what happens over the medium to long term, and that's where we really need growth to start to pick up, and that's all about the stuff we've spoken about in the past about productivity and transforming that, because we're still projecting that growth will pick up to around about 1.5, 1.6 over the long term, which is still relatively fragile in comparison to our long-term historical average in Scotland.
Yeah, I think long-term historical average is going to be changing if we're going to be stuck on these kind of low growth projections. I mean, I think we're nowhere near where we were before the kind of financial crash in 2007, 2008. It seems that we're still trying to recover from that.
Yeah, definitely.
Situation.
And its productivity hasn't turned around. I mean, I think we've now got pretty much a good understanding about why productivity is so bad in the UK, and about a third of that is low capital investment relative to our key competitors. And then the other 2/3 is essentially what, as economists, we would call total factor productivity. It's essentially how we convert our inputs into outputs, and that's innovation, it's skills, it's skills in the right jobs that we need, etc. So we've got quite a clear, good diagnosis of why productivity has been poor, but we still haven't yet sorted it or turned it around.
I mean, I suppose one side effect of employer national insurance contributions going up is it might incentivise, as companies like Toyota have said, further investment in capital as opposed to labour, which could bring long-term dividends, but whether it will or not remains to be seen, of course. Yeah,
and I guess there's a question about what's your optimal tax structure to encourage the right balance of labour and capital in your economy, and
not that was the reason for it being implemented.
Yeah, exactly. It needs a much broader conversation about what is your optimal incentives about what you're trying to invest in and grow over time. Yeah,
I mean, in terms of one of the interesting things about tax was you said that we revised down our forecast of Scottish income tax in 23-24 based on information we received on growth in tax paid through self-assessment. So what has been the change there?
So this is a really good question, because it's, I think, something we're really keen to raise. It's quite important. So you'll recall that one of the real challenges we have in forecasting income tax is that we can get quite good data on earned income, so the income that people are paying through PAYE, and that's the thing that we track through what we call the RTI data. And that's really good information. It's provided by HMRC. It works out essentially what they're collecting from employers. And that's the main anchor that we use to forecast income tax. There's then this other component, which is self-assessment, which you'll recall, I think, when we've chatted after our forecast evaluation has come about, and it's exceptionally volatile. And not only is it exceptionally volatile, the real problem is that we get no data on that through the year at all. We have no idea what is coming. So we essentially have to make a judgment that we think it's going to be broadly aligned with what is coming through the RTI. And you'll recall, I think, a couple of years ago, we had a huge growth in self-assessment, and then it fell back. What we get now from HMRC, quite helpfully, is an early indication from them of what they think is coming through self-assessment at the UK level based upon what they have for the year, which would be, in this case, it's 23-24. And that suggests actually quite a low growth in self-assessment in Scotland. So we've adjusted our forecast for, or our projection for Scottish income tax in 23-24 down, and that's the main part of that £240 million reduction. The key point is that doesn't that's not had an impact on the budget yet, but it might have an impact upon when we get the outturn data in July, because that will then help confirm the reconciliation that will come in next year.
Mm-hmm. And you've also said in paragraph 4.18 that the income tax net position is projected to be £616 million in 25-26, which is £222 million lower than the December 2024 projection.
Yeah. So there's a couple of things, again, quite important that are going on here. So the first thing is that if you look at the number for 24-25, you'll recall in December we highlighted that there'd been quite a change in the projection for the block grant adjustment, largely through changes in outturn data at the UK, but also changes in the OBR forecast for earnings. And this comes back to, I think, a really important point that I think something we need to keep emphasising is that the net tax position can change because of changes at the UK, not just what's happening in Scotland. It's the net position, it's the relative position that matters. And that's had quite a significant impact on the net tax position, eroding that because of better, essentially, data and forecasts coming through at the UK level. That, what we've then seen is into the latest forecasts from the OBR, they've essentially aligned their earnings forecast with our earnings forecast, and that's eroded the net tax position. And that is, again, one of the risks in the system. We've not changed really our forecast for Scotland, but they've become more optimistic about their forecast for the rest of the UK, so the net tax position becomes weaker for us.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. Just a couple of more points from me. One is about pay. Obviously, I mean, I think there's a kind of underlying frustration about the Scottish Government's pay policy. We've discussed this on a couple of occasions before. 3% on average over 3 years, 9% in total, and it seems that we're already going to be breaching that, certainly in terms of NHS pay already, and understandably unions in other sectors are looking for similar. So what impact do you think there would be on these projections if, for example, pay settlements with us across the public sector mirrored those of the NHS?
Mm-hmm. So, and from our perspective, we got what we needed for our forecasting around pay in terms of feeding that into our core elements. The point that we, I think, highlight is, again, just the point that we've highlighted last time, is that if you have a fixed budget and you have essentially a pay policy set out, and then you allocate budgets to portfolios, and within those portfolios, pay is around, can be up to about half of the money in there. If you choose to spend more money on pay, that necessarily means that you're going to have to spend money. You're going to have to spend less money elsewhere.
Or you reduce the workforce.
Or you reduce the workforce. Yeah. And I guess our point is, you need to explain and be transparent about what's happening in there. So it's not for us to set what the pay policy is, but it's just to say if you've got that pay policy and then you've made the
I'm just looking to see what you feel
basis.
the impact's going to be of that if we end up in that situation, because in the last 3 years we've obviously had emergency statements in the autumn, and I don't think anybody's particularly keen on seeing that again. I wouldn't think the government certainly would be in that position, but is that a possibility or are we not at that level?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's probably two things. So one is the spending. We know that at the UK level as well, some of the pay awards have come in ahead, slightly ahead of 2.8, slightly ahead of where the UK government had set it. That's obviously slightly lower than what the pay policy was in Scotland, but they've got it. So there might be money coming through in the spending review that might help which then might help ease some of the pressure for the Scottish Government. The second part I would say as well, the pay deals haven't been dramatically different from the pay policy set out by the government in a huge way. So it then really comes up to how much scope is there, how much a headroom is there within the various portfolios to be able to deal with that.
Well, hold on, if half the Scottish budget goes on pay, which would mean 30 billion, a 1% increase is 300 million, isn't it?
Yeah, but again, the question is how much can that be coped within existing portfolios? Like how much headroom is there in there? As we do highlight, though, there's the added pressure of national insurance increase as well. So it's not as though the budgets were didn't have pressures of pay already, because there were a lot of the budgets were having to take up the effects of national insurance. And again, so you're talking about 300 million. That's still a budget of 60 billion. So the government still have flexibilities within all of that. But clearly anything that you do on pay that is above policy means that that's going to have to find savings and address pressures elsewhere.
I mean, just the last question from me is on capital funding, because capital funding's had quite a significant boost, 15.7% real terms the current financial year, which is really quite impressive. However, what I found really bizarre about that is the fact that it's been boosted so much in the first year and then declines thereafter, 3.5% next year, and it goes up again slightly, and it goes down again, and then goes down for 3 consecutive years. And I think in a previous report you said that that by the end of by 2030-31 it will be much the same as it was in 2023. What's the thinking, do you think, behind that, and what are the pluses and minuses? Because I mean, from my perspective, I thought if you have a big increase in capital very suddenly, but you don't have the increased workforce to deliver it, you end up with inflation and construction and all other areas, and then if you end up with it going down, you're still stuck at those inflationary prices potentially, and you actually end up getting less bang for your buck overall. So I'm just wondering what your thinking is about that.
So a couple of things. So firstly, you'll recall that the previous UK government had a plan to cut capital spending significantly.
Yeah.
So this does look quite different from that. I think we were talking about by 29-30 about a 20% real terms reduction in capital spending.
Yeah.
So it does look quite different to the profile that was set out then. But you're right, what the government had announced was essentially a big uplift in the current financial year, and essentially largely kind of modest increases beyond that. So you're looking to that kind of relative real terms reduction there. Obviously, some of that's influenced by what the Scottish Government will do around capital borrowing and use of ScotWind funds, which again, hopefully we'll see a bit more clarity around that when the MTFS is published. Obviously, there was some money from ScotWind that was meant to be spent last year that's now been, it wasn't spent, so that gives them opportunity to do more into the future. We make a broad assumption that we think we'll borrow around about £300 million each year toward the end of the period. That could change, so they could offset some of the. They could look to borrow toward the end of the forecast horizon to increase some of the expenditure at the end if they want to do that. So spend less, borrow less now. If you've got more capital debt just now, save some of that borrowing and then borrow more toward the end of the period to try and smooth that out. The general point you're making, though, I think is right, is that you would want to have a plan for capital that isn't just 1 year, that is over a long period of time. And some of that's about what the UK government will do, what they need to do around setting out their priorities for the spending review over a period of time. But then the Scottish Government to follow suit with their capital investment pipeline and infrastructure pipeline, which I think is we're still waiting on the detail for that.
Yeah, we're hoping to see that in September. Have you had any indication of when you're likely to see that? If you're going to see that before then?
I've not seen anything. Have you? I don't think. No, the officials haven't either.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks very much. A number of colleagues are keen to come in. So first will be Liz, followed by John.
Thank you. Can I concentrate on social security, if I may? 2 points of clarification, Professor Roy. First, in your paragraph 47 in your summary paper, you said that you are forecasting spending on the policy to mitigate the two-child limit will be £156 million in 26-27, rising to £199 million in 2029-30. And if I'm not mistaken, I think that's around the 27-28% in 3-year period. Is that simply due to the number of youngsters that are involved? That increase, that level of increase, because it's quite substantial.
The increase from 156 to 199.
Yep.
Yeah, do you want to explain just how we calculate that, Michael?
Yeah, so there will be some uprating because we expect the universal credit rates to be uprated over that time. But the bigger effect, as you say, is the number of children, and it's because at the moment it's been introduced by age gradually, the two-child limit, as it applies to people getting that extra allowance or not getting the extra allowance, and then having that paid to them in Scotland. Gradually the ages increase. So I can't remember the exact age, but I can get the caseload in a second. Sorry. 1 second.
It would be very helpful if
yes,
you
I've
don't
got
have
the
it in front of
caseload
you.
hand now, sorry. Yeah, so in 26-27 we think it'll be 43,000 children.
Right.
And then over the period to 2030-31 that increases to 52,000.
But that still doesn't reflect a 27-28% increase.
And then, sorry, the amount increases from £70 to £75 per week. So those two things combined should lead to the... And, sorry, on top of that, there's a bit of a behavioural response that builds up over time, but that we think that's only around 10 million.
Sorry, can you just explain that behavioural change?
Yeah, so we think there's a chance that more families will sort of stay on universal credit than they otherwise would have, and then get Scottish Child Payment as a result, and also get the mitigation of the two-child limit. And some of that is just we've sort of taken a broad brush approach to it rather than thinking about the detail about what individual responses will be, but it's around sort of the work incentives because of the cliff edge that we've seen in it, where we think it's about sort of the difference of if someone, as a family, has a decision to make, say, about taking on more hours, or in terms of employment, if they take on more hours and they lose their entitlement to universal credit, they don't just lose the universal credit, which would be quite a small amount because it's tapered by that point. It's the cliff edge then of Scottish Child Payment and the two-child limit and mitigation that would then come to around £8,000 per year. So it's sort of, that's what, although we think anyway, because the families, they've got, if they're large families anyway, there's not going to be that many affected there, but just those small changes because of quite large amounts in there.
Okay, thank you. I think I've got most of that. Secondly, Professor Roy, obviously, at one of your recent breakfasts, you spelt out the challenge of an ageing population, not just in this country, but right across the world. Quite rightly so, that's obviously having a major impact on the cost of social security budgets. How easy is it to make comparative studies, or are the statistics available for comparative studies to recognise whether we have got any exceptional trends in Scotland?
So first of all, just come back to just really quickly on the two-child payment. We can send the calculation. When we published in January, we set out the various numbers to that, which separate that, so we can share that. I mean, I think on it is quite difficult on to do international comparisons. This because that you have different. It's not just social security that's different, but the delivery of public services is completely different, and the tax is completely different in that. So it's difficult to do a comparison of the public finances element of it. You can look at what strengths and weaknesses within all of that. So that's why a lot of the time we will then obviously compare it to what's happening elsewhere in the rest of the UK. In terms of the population dynamics, in terms of the specifics in there, I think, the issues that we've spoken about in our health report, I think, are worth reiterating there. So firstly, around the fact that Scotland starts from a relatively less healthy position than the UK overall. Now that's built into initially the kind of devolution, so that when the no better or worse off that was underpinning the initial transfer of that. So that's baked into that. So you have higher social security spending on disability per head in Scotland relative to the rest of the UK. What matters is what happens from this point onwards. So if we can become healthier, if we can offset some of the increase in some payments, particularly around the mental health and well-being that we've spoken about that is there, then that would potentially work in Scotland's favour from a public finances.
It seems to me that the rate of increase in the social security payments in Scotland seems to be pretty high. In relation to other countries from what I could extrapolate. And it's that rate of increase that I think needs to be interrogated, and that comes down to Scotland being a less healthy nation. That might be, obviously that's important in terms of setting policy. So the health is part of it, The second bit is what we've spoken about the next 10 to 15 years about our demographic ageing going ahead of the rest of the UK. And again, there's a positive correlation between age and some of these payments, which in turn will have an impact there. The final part I would say is I think the general point you're making, I think, is the key kind of public policy question, which is why are we seeing a significant increase in inflows into these payments? And I think we've spoken about some of the numbers before, where we're seeing a more than doubling of our rate of applications relative to pre-COVID. I think for child disability payments, it's a trebling relative to pre-COVID. The bit that we think we need to think about is, one is how much of this is because of the outcomes of what the government policy is trying to do, which is trying to encourage more people and support more people to apply. So people who should have having these payments in the past but haven't because of the process has been difficult, and how much of this will level off. Secondly, how much of this is being driven by real concerns within society about mental well-being, particularly amongst young people, and how much of that is driving it. And then again, thirdly, how does this look relative to the trends that everybody else is seeing around the world? Which brings me to a point that was raised almost a couple of years ago now, when the Scottish Fiscal Commission said that the introduction of the so-called light touch reviews was a major factor in rising costs, pointing out that 2% of the reviews resulting in a claim being stopped, whereas it was 16% for PIP in England and Wales. Now, the Cabinet Secretary for Social Justice slightly rebutted that, saying that it wasn't the result of the soft touch system, but more that it was predominantly a result of raising awareness campaigns and increasing public trust to apply for it. Do you have any refinement to your view on this, having had another 2 years of statistics?
Yeah, so I mean, I think Michael, you might want to come in and specific to the data, but the data is we're still seeing that trend. So we're still seeing a very low outflow of coming through the annual reward, still of 2%, I think is the most recent data we have. So it's still 2% comparison to the 16% of disallowed and 6% have decreased in terms of PIP. I guess the point is it's light touch, not soft touch. I think that's something where I think sometimes
I'm quoting the Cabinet.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because I think there is something. Sometimes that can be seen as being kind of a slightly negative element. The policy of the government is to make it very supportive for people who are on payments to go through annual reviews and to remain on those payments. So it naturally follows that you would expect more people to remain on these payments otherwise, and that can be through marketing campaigns, but that would be more about take-up rather than remaining on it. So the remaining on it is more about how the review process works, and that quite different approach in Scotland relative to the rest of the UK. So
as the statistics are just now, you would anticipate that 2% against 16% roughly is going to continue?
Yeah, so we increase it slightly. So we think that the number for Scotland will the percentage will increase. I think we forecast up to 6%. Is that right?
Yeah.
Can I ask why?
Yeah, so it's to do with the mix. So the majority of reviews that have taken place so far are for cases that have been moved over from PIP into ADP, and it's just part of the review process there. So the people who've been in receipt of a disability payment for a longer time, but then we're seeing more reviews coming in now for people who applied, new applicants to ADP in Scotland, and because they've been on for a shorter time, perhaps have less severe conditions, those cases have a slightly higher rate of being decreased or disallowed at award review. And just as that share of the overall caseload increases, then it's just the balance. So we have assumptions where we think for the longer term ones that the exit rate will stay as it is at the moment, and then for the new group the exit rate will stay fairly static, but then just that mix means that the overall average increases.
Okay. Just the key point of that is that will still be different to the rest of the UK, so it will still be higher than there'll still be fewer people outflowing relative to the rest of the UK. But it is a risk that we've highlighted in our forecast that we think that rate will increase. There'll be more outflows. If that doesn't happen, then that will add to
which may happen and may be accentuated by the change to PIP, presumably.
Well, that's the whole point about the relative difference is the key, and what that might mean in terms of the net funding position.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. John, to be followed by Michael.
Thanks very much, Convener. Just a few points probably to follow on. The fact that there was this delay and you're having to kind of redo forecasts to some extent in June, is that causing you extra cost or extra work? Or?
I mean, no. I mean, nothing that is not within our capability to do.
Okay, that's reassuring. I suppose you've got a fixed budget as well, so you've got to live within it. I mean, you've been asked already about this, the pay increases and the pay policy and inflation, and they're all kind of all tied together, I think, because the 3% for a year or 9% for 3 years, I think that was set when inflation was expected to be below 3%. And we're now at whatever, 3.2, 3.5, I think. Yeah. And therefore, everybody's expecting a pay increase at least to match inflation. And I think the NHS is 4.25, if I'm correct. Yeah. But then we will get more tax, won't we? Because if these pay increases are all a bit higher, and presumably in the private sector as well as the public sector, then we will get some more tax. But what's the timing of that? Is that tax coming in doesn't help this year's budget, does it?
No, because the budget will be set on income tax. So you'll be looking at a reconciliation further down the line. But crucially, remember as well, it's the net tax position that matters for the funding position. So if you've got higher inflation, higher pay awards in Scotland, you've got higher pay awards in the rest of the UK, then both the UK and Scottish tax revenues would rise, which you would expect roughly they'll offset one another.
Yes.
And we won't know that for another 3 years.
Well, exactly, that's right. So even if we expect there's more tax coming in, that doesn't help us in any way this year because that's the...
The only thing would be, as I said, that might happen is that if pay awards are coming in higher at the UK level, UK government might respond and give more money to departments to cope with higher pay awards because of exactly what you're saying, higher inflation. Yes. And we would get Barnett consequentials from that, which would open up the Scottish Government's ability to do that. But that would obviously depend upon what happens tomorrow.
Yeah. OK, that's helpful. Thank you. Well, perhaps related to that, actually, I saw in one of your papers, if I can find the right place, you talk about how, when UK give pay rises, then it depends how it's funded. I think I'm on page 7, paragraph 18. That's right. And, I mean, again, this frustrates me because it's also short-term and we're all trying to look at a longer-term plan, and yet you say, specifically, it depends on whether pay increases over and above the current UK budget plans are funded from new additional money or from existing departmental resources. So, we're back to this living hand-to-mouth kind of thing that we just do not know what's happening. Is that correct?
Yeah, and so this comes back, I guess, to the general point about, in an ideal world, what you would do is that you would essentially set out plans over 4 to 5 years with very clear plans about what you want to prioritise in terms of spending, and then within that you've got a very clear pay policy that underpins all of that. And the spending reviews are the ideal time to do that. You're then right that within that, at the margin, if you then have pay awards within year or pay awards for the year ahead that are then different from your stated pay policy, what matters then is at a UK level, how do you fund them? The Scottish Government doesn't have the luxury of that because essentially it can't borrow more money, it can't do a quick increase in a tax which can then use that to then fund. So it really depends upon whether the UK Government say we're now going to give more money to departments and Whitehall departments to fund these pay awards. If they do, Barnett consequentials would follow through. If they don't and they say essentially deal with it within your existing allocation, then there'll be no Barnett consequentials, and then the Scottish Government will have no additional money flowing through from that.
And that applies to like welfare as well. I mean, if there is going to be an announcement tomorrow of increased welfare spending in some way, again, we won't know until they tell us. Would we expect to know tomorrow, or will it be some time in the future, do you think, that we would know where that money is coming from?
So there's a couple of things. So there's one, if the government announced, the UK government announced, immediate changes, for example, to departmental spending for this year, Barnett consequentials would come through, the whole statement of funding policy would work that through. If there's changing in the funding for Social Security, the way that would come through would be through the BGAs, and the adjustments to the BGAs that would take place within the year. There's then the technicalities about whether or not the Scottish Government can defer some of that. You remember the things.
Yes,
was
right,
it? I can't remember the example. Was it last year? Was it winter fuel? Was it winter fuel payment? We could defer it
because if that affected us negatively, but presumably if it's positive, then we're going to probably take the money immediately, aren't we?
Well, that's.
Yes. Okay. You were asked about the productivity and the capital investment, and I just wanted to press you on that one. Mm-hmm. Is it any capital investment will inevitably help productivity, or do we need to be... Do you look at, where is the capital investment going? Because, for example, I was thinking if you buy a new train, well, maybe people's comfort and things is a bit more reliable, but actually it's still moving 200 people from A to B, so it doesn't really increase productivity?
Yeah. So I wish Francis was here, because this is Francis's big thing, is capital investment and how we do it. So you're right. There's investment that is particularly targeted at say boosting productivity really closely, whether that be investment in skills, whether that be investment in infrastructure that is to deal with a bottleneck or something like that, where you would genuinely see this is quite a significant increase in productivity. A lot of capital investment is replacement, so it's really just keeping things ticking over. And some capital investment might actually be for very, very good reasons, but are not designed to support economic growth. So building a hospital, for example, would create construction output, which would boost the economy, but you're not really building a hospital to improve the immediate productivity performance of the economy. You're doing it for other reasons. So public sector capital investment is one enabler of overall productivity growth, but it's not the only one. It depends on a whole multitude of other factors.
And do you look below, I mean, at the moment you don't have a lot of detail for, say, the next 5 years as to where the capital expenditure will be, but if you get that information, will that impact on your forecast?
So that it doesn't. So if we saw a really big significant change up or down in capital investment, then it's probably likely to be a material factor. We would change our view on that. But again, typically the numbers we're talking about are a few £100 million here or there. In the short run, that wouldn't really have much of an impact on our overall economic forecast. So an extra £200 million in capital investment in an economy of 160,000 million, it wouldn't really change our view on that. Clearly, the more capital investment you can do over the long term is about turning that, long-term, total factor productivity up. But we wouldn't really immediately change unless there was like no money or, trebling the money.
Mm-hmm. And the final area I wanted to raise was the 27-28 negative reconciliation, 851 million. I mean, that sounds absolutely scary because we've only got a limit of whatever it is, 600-700. But I mean, this is a figure that's going up and down. And I mean, I think every figure that we've mentioned, including social security and so on, will impact on that, won't it? So, I mean, it's incredibly difficult to predict that. Is that right?
Yeah. So It's not incredibly difficult to predict in the sense of the scale or the relative sign of it. But you're right, the exact number will move. So I think it's gone up from, was it 700 million when we talked about it in December to 850 million just now. And there's a couple of things I would say that are really important. I mean, part of this is the nature of the framework. This moves around because of the specifics of the framework we have. And as you recall, actually, and it's not saying, passing the buck, because sometimes it's our forecasts that change, but the key reason for the reconciliation is better outturn data at the UK. So HMRC have just collected better data at the UK, and the UK tax performance was better than it thought it was. The OBR changing their forecast to become more aligned with ours. So remember, you recall that we were more optimistic than them. They've now essentially aligned it for that year. And also the kind of tax richness of growth in the UK level. So again, you have earnings growth at the UK, but they have very rich taxpayers relative to us, so that in turn leads to effects coming through. And you put all that together, on a tax in Scotland over 20 billion, you get these variations moving around, and that leads to quite a significant reconciliation. The first point. The second point is then, it's not so much the movement of reconciliation, it's how much flexibility have you got to manage that uncertainty. And that's where I think we're just highlighting that there's potentially a real challenge for the government in 27-28, because the borrowing powers they have to offset reconciliations might not be sufficient in that year to offset it in full.
But we'll get a clearer picture as we move forward.
Yes. Yeah. So it will change, and we'll keep updating that number as we go.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Convener.
Thank you. Michael, to be followed by Craig.
Thanks, Convener. Can I come back to this issue of the social security payments in the first instance, and Mr Davidson's comments about the behavioural effects around the interaction of these different, I understand a complex situation. Can I ask what information the Scottish Government has supplied to you about the policy design in terms of their understanding of the thresholds, the interaction of the thresholds and the behavioural effects? Why did they choose this method to best alleviate poverty?
So we wouldn't be party to the discussion about what motivated that. So what we do is we essentially take the policy that government want to implement, and then we'll model what we think the effects would be. That in turn would maybe potentially influence the government about what they would do, but we wouldn't be there to design to say this is the optimal decision by the government to tackle child poverty. We were told the policy was to mitigate the two-child limit, and then we essentially take that as their policy design and model it.
So they don't supply you with any of the working that they've done in terms of how they've evaluated whether it should be the policy approach that they might take? I understand your point about motivation. That's not really my question on this. We can agree about the motivation. We decide about what is the most effective way of doing it.
Yeah.
And it sounds like from what Mr Davidson was describing, there's a deep level of complexity about the behavioural effects and about thresholds and when people exit and how these things are combined. But there was no working provided to you as to the assumptions that they were working on as to why they had chosen that approach.
I don't know about the discussion in the policy officials, but again, just to be clear, so we would make our own judgment call about what we think the behavioural effects would be, etc. So it's entirely fine, and I'm sure it maybe is, that government would chat with our officials about what it would be, but ultimately it's our judgment call about saying that if you mitigate the two-child limit at that threshold, we'll then be the ones who decide what the behavioural effects will be. They'll critique it and challenge it as officials, but there wouldn't be a policy that, and it wouldn't be appropriate for them to say, this is what we think your behavioural effect should be, Graham, from this policy we've done. We wouldn't do that or accept that.
Yeah, I'm glad you don't take their homework as read. But Mr Davidson?
About the information received.
Yes.
Well, we had to make a few more assumptions when we did the costing in January, but then the forecast that we produced in May is based and consistent with the consultation document that the Scottish Government published on how they would deliver it. So there's quite a lot of detail there on their preferred policy, means of delivery and things like that. So that's what our forecast in May has been based on, but it was pretty consistent with the assumptions that we'd made in January anyway.
Okay. You'll understand in terms of the you're evaluating the fiscal impacts of the approach. One of the interests of this committee is obviously about the effectiveness of the approach that's chosen. But I was interested in that side of it. Okay. Moving on to the economic performance gap. So in 22-23, that was £624 million. And December 24, £838 million. May 2025, £1.06 billion. So increasing quite significantly over the last 2 years. Also picking up on what colleagues were also saying about the negative income tax reconciliation, that's grown by 20% in the last 6 months. I understand some of the factors involved in that. Are you concerned by what appears to be, all of these different factors, a growing gap that the Scottish Government have across these different areas?
A couple of things. So one is, if you look at, on our figure 4.4, we look at the net tax position. And so this net tax position is still positive, so the government is still raising more revenue than otherwise would have been the case without tax devolution, and that's the stated policy to do that. The net tax position, I think, is really interesting, because that essentially is what we do for that, just to really explain the calculation. Because it's not an assessment of Scottish Government policy or performance. It's essentially saying, if you implemented these tax policies and had exactly the same earnings growth and economic performance as the rest of the UK, how much would you potentially be raising? And then it essentially compares that to how much is actually projected to be raised, and that's where the gap comes from. So the gap is essentially everything that is not explained by that policy. So it is, as we highlight in the thing, it could be different policy decisions, but it could be a UK government decision having an impact on Scotland relative to the rest of the UK. It could be a Scottish government decision having an impact on Scotland relative to the UK. It could just be general economic performance in Scotland lagging behind the UK. It could be different sector performance. So we've highlighted before some of the challenges we see in the decline in relative taxpayer per head in the North East. So that's naturally been a rich source of tax revenue for Scotland relative to other parts of the UK. That was baked into our baseline when we got the tax devolution. So if you have a decline in oil and gas, then that naturally becomes less positive over time. And things like London's in the UK number. So if London, if the city has a really good year, then that means that the net tax position is going to be harder for Scotland to do that. So I think there's a really interesting thing about, if we take a step back, it's you want that you want that economic performance gap to be as small as possible, ideally positive, because then that means that you're getting even more benefits coming through. So the fact that it's negative, and it's becoming more negative in part because we're seeing faster earnings growth and taxes at the UK, is money that is essentially not there that otherwise could have been.
Yeah. So I understand all of that. That's a useful explanation. Perhaps one of my colleagues has doubts about some of the terminology, it's fair to say, that we've come back to around this on a few occasions. But the overall picture that you presented by the update feels like it's a worsening situation, that the challenge for the Scottish Government across these different areas, whether it be in the area of economic performance and tax take that you've illustrated there, whether it be in the scale, the gap between the amount of money we have on social security otherwise, are you more or less concerned than you were 12 months ago?
Yeah. Well, I think if you look at, I guess, in December on the two big bits around the net tax position, the net tax position is less positive than it was back in December. If you look at the social security position, it's more negative than it was back in December. And the key point, I think, and I've actually written about this in the paper yesterday, in the Herald talking about this, is that the key reason for that isn't actually anything that's really happened too much in Scotland. It's because of what's happening elsewhere in the rest of the UK. And that's one of the risks within this framework. It's not just about how Scotland does, it's about how the rest of the UK does, and also about UK government decisions too.
Okay. I also understand that. It's well recognised. It doesn't change the fact that we should be concerned about these figures. So are you more or less concerned than you were 12 months ago about the broad picture that you've painted in this update?
I think that, yeah, I mean, I think that the part of it depends what happens coming through in the spending review, because that is ultimately, the Barnett formula is still the biggest element in that. But if you look at the key components around on tax, yeah, I mean, the net tax position on income tax has got worse. The social security gap is projected to get wider toward the end of the horizon. There are still things that we need to wait and see what happens. So obviously announcements by the UK government on social security might offset some of that decline that we've projected. So things like the winter fuel payments, for example, might have a small marginal impact if there's more money flowing through. And ultimately, as Mr Mason was saying as well, the net tax position might move around again, but it's certainly got more negative than it was back in December.
Okay. You mentioned in the spending review, the UK spending review tomorrow. What discussions have you had with regards to Scottish spending review?
I've not had anything in particular. I did note that the Cabinet Secretary was talking about setting out the detail around that alongside publishing the MTFS, the timeline for that. So we'll wait to see what that says and then be ready to respond to that.
So do you think there should be a Scottish spending review? Would you think that would be a prudent thing to do?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've been very clear that I think spending reviews are really, really important for a whole variety of different reasons. One, because they essentially stop you focusing on the day-to-day and take a step back about where you're heading in terms of overall public policy. So spending reviews are really good. They give a chance to look at actually what the outcomes you're trying to achieve, and is that all aligned in a good place, and also lets you think over the next 4 to 5 years. So I think spending reviews in principle are a really good thing to do, and we've not really had that regularity in Scotland for a long time.
Do you think that's achievable within the next 6 to 9 months for the government to look through, say, a zero-based budgeting approach, which has been advocated by members of the committee, to look through the lines of spending to try and reset the budget and project it forward?
It's probably a question you should really for the Cabinet Secretary.
I suppose I'm talking about the technicality of it, Professor Roy. Do you think that is achievable rather than desirable? I understand there's lots of politics in this, and I don't want to draw you on that, but on a technical level, do you think it can be done? Yeah,
I mean, I think everything's achievable. I guess the question is how much detail do you go into and how rigorous it is. So I guess there's that phrase before the spending review, comprehensive spending review. It's how comprehensive is that? It's taken, obviously the UK government have taken quite a bit of time to do that, so nearly a year for them to do it as a root and branch kind of review. There's an advantage in some ways of doing it after an election in that sense, because you've then got it setting out for a long time. Clearly the challenge in Scotland is that if you delay it longer, you're then rubbing up against the fact that you're now moving into the kind of the middle period of a UK spending review, so you're lagging behind. In general, I think what the UK government are trying to do about having a comprehensive spending review and then having a regular update, I think is a much more effective way to do it than we've had in the past.
Yeah. Because if we get ourselves in a position in Scotland where we undertake this after an election in 2026, as you say, you're then moving into the midpoint of that and actually the cycles. And we've had lots of discussion about the problem of an MTFS because events come along and change. I mean, would your view that just to get ahead, let's get this done, would that be the best thing to try and address the strategic challenges that you've set out in the report?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately it'll be for government to decide the specific timing of it and what they do. I think the general point, though, I think is, and comes back to the point about us, about what I was talking about the timing and things. A lot of the time we focus very much on the marginal piece. So you're quite right, Convener, to mention 1% in the budget in terms of pay, that's 300 million, that's entirely right. We're talking about a budget that's £60 billion with some huge challenges coming down the line on health, on ageing, and the net zero. And there's a broader question that we must be able to have a conversation about that totality and the strategic direction of it, and then say, yes, but there's going to be marginal changes around all of that. And I think that the sooner you can do a spending review, I think, in principle, the better. But it's up to government and Parliament to decide when that would specifically be.
Great. One last issue about taking it back to the issue of productivity. And you mentioned about the comparative capital investment being lower in Scotland. I suppose one thing that I've found, I attended an excellent conference on Friday, which I chaired a session at, and one of the things I found slightly puzzling, I think, coming out of it, so I was put the question I didn't get answered at the conference here in committee instead on the record, about the availability of capital to firms in Scotland, and that certainly prior to the Ukraine crisis, there has companies would tell me, firms would tell me that actually the availability of capital was not the problem. Capital was relatively cheap for a long period of time with low interest rates. It was accessible. Obviously, interest rates have increased now. It's a little bit more difficult to access for different firms. But this is a long-term problem. It's not just a short-term problem post-Ukraine that we've had. So in a marketplace where capital was cheap, Scottish firms were still underinvesting in capital and productivity. Could you say why?
It's a great question. I mean, because this has been one of the real puzzles, and you mentioned Scotland, there's a general puzzle across the UK about underinvestment of companies, and part of that was part of the explanation was a thought that, particularly post financial crisis, that companies were essentially hoarding cash to essentially build up resilience for potentially the future shock, which future shocks happened, but they kept on hoarding cash, and that didn't lead to unlocking of investment. So it's not about available of capital in terms of borrowing. It's actually using the capital, using the potential that has been built into the UK economy. And some of that is about the huge sums that are in pension funds potentially waiting to be invested. How do we unlock that? We've never really done that well in comparison to other countries. I guess it's about encouraging that kind of vision of investing and taking that long-term view amongst companies that are sitting on huge balance sheets that haven't been able to do it. I think the bit on a policy question I think is really interesting is there's been a lot of funding. The question is, has it been the right type of funding? And I think there's much more being done to kind of look at that. Some of the changes around the fiscal framework of the UK to try and potentially give more flexibilities in that. Some of the work the British Business Bank does to try and look at more innovative ways of funding that potentially unlocks greater potential. But as I said, what's quite interesting, if you come back to the explanation about why the UK has been lagging behind, about a third of that comes from low investment, but we have huge funds that are sitting potentially being able to be invested.
Yeah, and the comparison that was drawn about the amount of capital that we retain in country in comparison to other developed nations was a striking one. But I was struck by this question in essence of the how firms are able to mobilise that capital and essentially the absorptive capacity of the economy to actually use that capital effectively. Because it strikes me that what you're saying here is that it's partly about the behaviour of firms and their questions about whether they're risk averse and whether they want to take and make investment here as elsewhere. Yeah. Is there anything you think that we could be doing to address those issues as opposed to just the question of capital flows?
Yeah, I mean, this is probably, I don't know if Domenico, you've got kind of any reflections on that as well. I mean, part of it is about the strength of the underlying ecosystem within the business base, which I think if you look at other countries around the world is much stronger at actually just enabling that flow of capital and funds coming around. So you look at what happens in Germany, for example, in the Mittelstadt, and how they've got a completely different model around how you unlock economic investment in there. Part of it, I think, is about, the types of companies that you're growing and the sectors they're investing in and your ability to unlock additional capital for projects that are doing and speed of agility and all of that. The bit that I thought was really interesting from the conference was about the questions about how much of investment or how much of the funds that we have in the UK get invested abroad versus how much gets invested domestically. And we tend to invest much more abroad than we do domestically in comparison to some of the other countries. And there's a question about that, kind of about how you can incentivise or skew more of that potential funds you've got of capital being into domestic companies, avoiding the thing we've got into in the past around picking winners or just throwing money after poor projects. But I don't know if you get any reflections on that.
Following the great financial crisis, there was a stream of regulatory reforms across a number of countries, certainly in Europe, the UK and the United States, just to quote a few. And lending standards have tightened up, so not just in this country, but also elsewhere. And clearly, on the one hand, tighten lending standards and tight regulatory reforms, of course, foster a sound financial system on the one hand, but on the other, clearly it has become at the margin more difficult for small and medium-sized companies to access capital. So there is a trade-off, and some countries might be going into different ways going forward, but certainly this is a reality that a number of countries are confronting with.
Okay. Just closing on this, convener. Firms have said to me that actually the challenge of attracting that investment for them has more been about the availability of C-suite talent within Scotland, finding the people who are able to actually run the company at that level to increase output, but also the skills base and accessing the right skills within Scotland, rather than the availability of capital. So is it, I suppose what I'm pointing is it not a more complex issue than just bulking up or putting in place capital controls or trying to find a more tax-efficient route to direct that investment into Scotland? There has to be actually a combination of those issues with the human factors rather than just the regulatory side of it.
Yeah, as I said, I think it's the entire underlying ecosystem that sits around the kind of the sectors, the high growth potential that you have. Just last week I was in Munich for a conference with the university. I was at the Technical University of Munich, and they're unbelievable about what they do in terms of that whole ecosystem of from students to startups to scale-ups to the support of the public sector to the support of the business community. They've had 21 unicorn companies linked to one university, either through graduates or through the research that comes out. They have 100 startups just within every year coming out of that. And that, you're right, there's a huge flow, there's a huge pot of capital sitting there waiting to be invested, but it's all crowding around young people coming through, ambitious to be entrepreneurial, set up their company with fantastic academic research, with a pipeline of support, training support, managerial support, ability to grow your business, all within a relatively small geography. And that's the bit where I think it's not just about the capital bit. They would tell you it's this really complex ecosystem that they've been able to build over 50 years.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I have to say, from my recalling of economic history, the issues that you talked about with regard to concerns about the amount of investment from British companies going overseas was an issue before the First World War. Actually, that's how long that's been an issue for the Scottish and UK economies. Craig, to be followed by Michelle.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Professor Roy. One of the features of the fiscal framework is that it links Scottish and UK fiscal and tax policy to relative economic growth and performance, leading to what you've described as this economic performance gap. Just in discussion with ministers, I've kind of picked up from them that that doesn't appear to be a particularly real concern to them because it's a sort of notional, academic, intangible figure. It isn't real money. So could you just clarify just how important it is that the government takes this issue seriously because of the interaction with the fiscal framework?
Yeah, so the one that the figure that matters ultimately is the net tax position. So that's essentially how much are you raising, and that's the figure which enters into the budget, which I think is £600 million we're projecting for 25-26. The thing about what we try and stress and what we do when we highlight this alternative, this kind of economic performance gap, is that the net tax position is essentially made up of two elements. It's made up of the tax policy decisions of the government in Scotland relative to the rest of the UK, and it's also made up by essentially how your tax base is doing. And that's essentially what matters in this fiscal framework. And we think it's quite important to look at both, to think about, okay, well, how much are you potentially raising from your tax policies, but how is your overall tax base doing within all of that? And that's where I think it is quite helpful to have this kind of hypothetical, this is what, if you had essentially had your tax policy and matched economic performance in the rest of the UK, then this is what you would essentially have. Because ultimately, I think as we've highlighted in the past, as well, is that growing the economy, the relative performance of the Scottish economy is absolutely fundamental to this framework, and that's why it's really important to highlight it, and that's why I think it's important to be cognizant of what you're seeing with it.
Yeah, no, that reminds me of a CEO I had who used to say to the sales teams, "Don't tell me how much you did sell. Tell me how much you didn't sell, and what didn't you bring in." But let's look at what the Scottish Government hasn't brought in one sense, because I think you made a projection in the past that said that the top rate of tax, the 48% rate, should have brought in £53 million in 24-25. But in the end, the Scottish Government realised just £8 million. That was from, I think, one of your previous reports. Obviously, those are earners earning over £124,000 or so. What would the reason be for such a significant difference between what you estimate to be brought in by a certain tax policy and the net results were just significantly less?
So I think we're relating there to things like behavioural change and how people might respond to different tax rates. And again, and what we do is essentially use evidence from some of the increasing evidence from the HMRC and are pulling together about what's been happening in Scotland, but crucially also as well about what international evidence shows. And what that shows is people on higher rates of tax typically adjust their behaviour in response to changes in tax policy, and that can largely be about things about. People think it's about people moving, but it's not. It's about people just adjusting their tax affairs, taking more of it in terms of dividend income, marginally changing hours worked, etc. And you don't need much of a change in people's behaviour before you have quite a significant change overall in the tax position. So changes in tax policy would give you a static effect, need to account for the fact that people will change their behaviour. And that's why, particularly for higher earners, we assume quite a high tax elasticity. So changes in tax policy would lead to a relatively marginal overall increase in revenue because people can adjust their tax affairs and tax behaviours. And that's why you would get quite a change.
And in terms of those sort of levels of behavioural change, presumably the greater the differential in tax between ourselves and the rest of the UK, we're more exposed, presumably, to those kinds of behavioural changes taking effect.
Yeah, I mean, what we'll do is we model tax elasticities, and clearly that means that if you have more of an increase, then you'll raise more revenue, but then the actual scale of potential behavioural change would be bigger there. There's a couple of things. I mean, there is some people have talked about whether there are things like are there tipping points, so for example, so could you actually potentially increase tax quite a bit and actually have relatively limited behavioural change, but once you get above a level, potentially you might have more behavioural change. A lot of it depends upon the individual circumstances. So people who might have one job that is very highly paid, then they might have very limited flexibility. If you're owner of a company, then self-employed, you might have much greater flexibility about how much you actually take as a dividend or how much you take as a salary and the like. This is one of the areas where I think we've highlighted is that HMRC are starting to pull together data sets, longitudinal data sets, that will let us be able to test this much more empirically about whether we've actually seen behavioural change going on. one thing I would say as well is that you are still seeing in-net migration into Scotland of taxpayers as well. So again, I think everything has to be taken in the round, where you might be seeing people's behavioural change, but they're at least settling. There's no evidence of large numbers of people leaving Scotland or not coming into Scotland because of the changes in taxation.
Has there been any assessment, because the Scottish Government obviously quote the overall figure, but has there been any assessment as to which tax bands those net inward migration, those who are coming into the country, fall into? Do they tend to be in the lower middle tax bands, or are we seeing greater numbers at the lower end of the pay spectrum?
I can't recall what the HMRC study did, whether it broke it down into different tax bands, but we can have a look at that and come back to you on that. Yeah.
Just in relation to, obviously, one of the issues with which I think you've described as an asymmetric and downside risk to the net tax position is your assessment of Scottish earnings growth relative to the OBRs. Why are the two organisations taking a slightly different view, and why is your outlook slightly rosier than the OBR in respect of Scottish earnings growth?
Yeah, so this is ask two economists a question, you'll get three different answers. So
you could be a one-handed economist.
Yeah. So we this is just something. So we have always been, as an institution, I think, slightly more optimistic about the outlook for earnings than the OBR. And there's a chart on page 39, figure 3.3, where you see our forecasts being slightly ahead of the OBR. Now, for the first few years of tax devolution, then what we were seeing was Scottish earnings lagging behind the rest of the UK, and that led to that led, again, coming back to your point about performance gap, that led to the net tax position not growing as much as we might have thought it would have been, because Scottish earnings were not tracking the UK. That then turned around for a couple of years, in part because of improvements in the energy sector in Aberdeen, but also we think relative performance of financial services in Edinburgh compared to London, and that led to Scottish earnings outperforming the UK for a couple of years. What we've seen recently is a closing of that gap, and essentially that what we saw in the most recent forecast in the OBR was them uplifting their forecast to now be more aligned to ours, and that is the key reason for why the net tax position has come down this year. Again, if you look at that chart, and what the risk is, that we are more optimistic than the OBR for earnings in 2026, 27 and 27, 28. And if they align it with us or we align with them, then the improvement in net tax position would deteriorate further.
One thing you didn't mention there, obviously you mentioned financial services and oil and gas, is the public sector pay settlement, something that's also given you some encouragement, because that tends to have been higher than the private sector recently, and we have more public sector workers in Scotland.
Yeah. So again, to come back to Mr. Mason's point, is that you get some of the recycling over time in terms of the pay awards in the public sector are higher than you get coming through on an income tax into that. And again, public sector pay awards have been higher in Scotland, and that was another factor that had led to that relative improvement in earnings.
In terms of unemployment, it's the figures sort of say 4 to 4.5%. If you then look at levels of economic inactivity, which are running just shy of 25%, you're then potentially getting up to close to 1 in 3 working age Scots not in employment. Mr. Davidson referred to perhaps issues within the benefit system that may be leading to behavioural change there as well, people just not simply taking up work. How concerned should we be as we look forward that effectively we're in a position where 28 to 30% of working age Scots aren't in employment? How does that aid our productivity moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, the numbers for Scotland are not that different from the rest of the UK overall when you take in activity and unemployment, and particularly if you look within the UK. So we're not that different from other kind of aspects of kind of other regions within the UK, kind of similar in that regard there. There's a couple of things I would say. So inactivity is a bit of a catch-all for a large kind of number of people. So there's some kind of, I would say, if I used in inverted commas, positive reasons to be inactive. If you're a full-time student, for example, then you'll be classified as inactive. Now, you might have views about how active students are, but they would be classified in statistics as being inactive. But clearly you're not worried about people in that because they're going through the education system. If you retire early, for example, you'll be classified as being inactive. The more concerning bits, we were more worried about people who are inactive, are the people who are inactive because they're maybe discouraged from the labour market, but crucially the people who are maybe inactive because of ill health. And what we've seen so much what we've seen recently in terms of inactivity has been a switching of people who were inactive for some other reason, now being inactive because of ill health, and that's a concern. That's not just a concern in Scotland; it's a concern in the UK. Because that suggests that there might be more significant reasons about why someone is not in the labour force. It's linked to their health and well-being, which suggests that there's something going on upstream or a challenge in society about why people are not able to be active in the labour market.
I accept that there probably there's a similarity with the rest of the UK, but am I right in thinking that there's not a similarity with other kind of Western economies of the same size as ours? Yeah, so
the kind of the relatively high levels of inactivity in the UK are bigger, particularly than they are in terms of other places in Europe. We have lower unemployment though, so again, if you go to places like France, etc., they have higher unemployment. We have more people classified as being inactive. I think the really interesting thing is that the national figures for inactivity hide huge variations across different parts of the country. So, and again, that's why the comparison between Scotland and the UK is perhaps not the right comparison. It's the comparison, say, between Edinburgh and, the kind of affluent parts of England, Inverclyde versus the, post-industrial regions of the north of England. That's where you get the biggest, I think, the most insights about what's driving inactivity in some key areas.
Yeah, and just to look at the sort of state of the Scottish Government's budget this year and then looking forward, we're seeing at a UK government level quite big policy changes taking place that are going to have a material effect on the Scottish budget. Mm-hmm. We're seeing potential reversal, for example, of the winter fuel payment that will give the Scottish Government more money effectively, and possibly maybe the scaling back of other welfare reforms at a UK level. The consequence of that could be, of course, that there will be further cuts at a UK level to health or education or areas where we get a devolved Barnett consequential funding. How difficult will this make it for the Scottish Government, which I think by common consent seems to be too last minute in terms of the way in which it approaches their budgetary considerations? How difficult is it going to make for the Scottish Government to actually forecast for the next sort of 24, 36 months?
Mm-hmm. There's a couple of things. I mean, what the UK government have done is set out the broad parameters for departmental spending. So what we'll get tomorrow is the detailed intricacies between different departments, which at the margin will lead to modest changes in the relative position around Barnett consequentials relative to that total. So there is actually a lot of information out there that the government can use to plan, and that was one of the key reasons why the government said in February that they were going to publish the MTFS before the spending review, and they were relaxed about doing that because actually the broad parameter of departmental spending was set. So what we'll get tomorrow is a bit more detail, but the government have a lot of information to plan about what will happen to their overall budget. And even things like the winter fuel payment, you're talking about potential implications of a small number of hundreds of millions of pounds, if that, in a budget of nearly £60 billion. So the government have a lot of information. They have obviously the forecasts, they have the trajectory for Social Security, have the broad outline about what the block grant would look like. So yeah, you'll get a lot of things changing at the margin, but overall the government have a pretty clear indication about where the overall public finances are trending, and things like when the reconciliations will hit.
Yeah, no, super, thank you.
Great. Gail.
Good morning. I'll keep my questions brief. I think this has been so invaluable, and it's been interesting for me listening to it. I mean, obviously we've had a number of conversations about the so-called economic performance gap, and in reality you've really clearly illustrated why it's more complex than simply seeking top lines. And I'm quite intrigued that the percentage of our conversation this morning about getting further clarity on the operation of the fiscal framework with the different events that influence data and information coming in from the UK government and the Scottish government itself. I mean, I kind of feel that every time we come up with these sessions that we're descending in terms of transparency, which has to underpin the point of why we're doing this, seems ever more opaque, ironically, as we get more data and information, and it clearly is driven by a system that we have in place that really, ironically, seems to encourage short-termism and more complexity and becomes ever more inefficient. That's just my kind of observation from sitting and listening to this session. But I'd be interested in your views as well, because your work rate must be increasing as well.
Yeah, I mean, far be it from me to be more optimistic than you as the economist here. There's a couple of things I would say. So one is, I think you're right. I mean, I think the nature of this fiscal framework means there's a lot of moving parts, and a lot of these moving parts change relatively regularly, whether it be economic performance gap or the UK government making an announcement on social security reform, which has an impact on the Scottish budget, or we get a spending review, so we're waiting on Barnett consequentials. So there's a lot of things moving around in all of that. Probably my answer to you, and I guess the point that we are kind of, I think is really important for government to think about as well, if you take a step back, a lot of the stuff we're talking about is marginal changes within a context of an overall large budget. And so the example around winter fuel payments and things, I mean, I don't know, Michael might be able to work out on an envelope quickly what the numbers we're talking about, but we were talking about the difference, I think, between the Scottish Government and the UK Government policy last time of up to about 80 million, something like that. It came through. Even the two-child limit, I think, is up to 190 million. You were talking about the growth from 156, I think it was, to 190 million. And that's a really important question. But you're talking about 30 million in a budget of 60,000 million. And I think sometimes we lose sight, we focus really on the minutiae when the real big public policy questions are, if you've got a budget of 60,000 million, how do you spend that most effectively in order to support the priorities of child poverty or economic development or tackling net zero? And I think sometimes there's a tendency for us to dive into the detail, which is quite right, and to scrutinise the forecast and the elements of it. But actually the big picture trends are pretty stable.
Okay, that's very helpful, thank you. I just wanted to pick up on a comment you made earlier about HMRC. Have you got any kind of indication from them that they might start to make more data available? And you were talking about self-employed people. I mean, obviously, making tax digital coming in the next tax year, there'll be much more data available, even if it's not collected, and that could be in future phases. And also, there must still be more data available with kind of interim people. I mean, that came in a few years ago, people making kind of mid-year payments as well. Because, I mean, the whole point of this is to make data more readily available to mitigate this problem of self-employed figures.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think all of that helps, and I have to say HMRC have been really good about sharing information and data that they get, and that definitely does help, and things like the RTI and so on, and the fact that they're now able to give us this indication about what might be coming through self-assessment as a, this is what we're seeing, and then we can then take that into consideration for the update here in advance of the outturn we'll get in July. The challenge, though, with self-assessment, and the real challenge is that I don't know if anybody here does self-assessment, but most people that I know will do it in January. So you're doing it right at the end. So for the tax year that was 2023-2024, people were doing it in January 2025. So you're literally, you don't know until a couple of months afterwards, until they've actually got it coming through, which then means they can then tell us that, but they can't tell us any earlier than that, just because that's the way they do it. So you need more a structural change in how you do things like self-assessment and get it to do earlier before it would really help us. But it is a concern. You see that is the bit that is just really volatile in Scotland and the UK.
Okay. And last week question, I thought about it, about economically inactive. I've previously kind of asked about the extent to which you disaggregate data by sex, because that often gives interesting patterns, and it just makes me think that some of the stuff we're seeing, I'm wondering to what extent we might see emerging patterns when we do that. When, obviously economically inactive, there's always going to be a big portion of childcare in that anyway. But have you got any sense, and do you disaggregate data in this way? Have you got any further plans to derive more kind of key insights.
Yeah, so in inactivity we rely on what the ONS produce around on the labour market, and you'll see again some frustrations with us about the quality of the data that ONS are producing on the labour market, and some real concerns about the labour force survey. That is disaggregated by sex, and it's also disaggregated by age, and also the reason for inactivity. The challenge becomes, this is why we really need them to produce the robust data, is that once you start to drill in on that age, sex, reason for inactivity, you could start to get into relatively small samples, particularly in Scotland. So we need that to be as representative, robust as possible.
And that's, sorry to interrupt, but that's like over recent years been an issue, that the scale of the ONS data set for Scotland, hasn't it? Has that moved on at all?
It's still a work in progress. So the Scottish Government boosts the ONS data, so it is more representative and it helps. But there's been bigger challenges in ONS and real lack of concerns about LFS. I think the ONS view is that they're more confident with the LFS, but I know that the Bank of England and others still don't use it. And I think the challenge for us is that once you try to drill into exactly the types of policy questions you're interested in, if you don't have confidence in the data, then you could really end up making really poor policy judgments on the back of that. So.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Just a couple of further points from me. Just one in terms of the social security. I was curious about employability services. In the wee note says the forecast of employability services, an indicative forecast, includes spending on Fair Start Scotland and elements of No One Left Behind. Now, you've got increases from 52 million to 60 million to 73 million the current year, which is increases of about 15 to 20% per year, and then it just goes. Then you've got it projected to go from 73 to 70 million, and remaining at that figure for 5 years. Is there a reason for that?
Yeah,
just a
Michael,
curiosity. So only static budget I've seen in your whole report.
So we produce, as we say, it's a sort of illustrative forecast because we take the budget allocation from the Scottish Government and then estimate the proportion that is on that falls within our remit based on existing use of it. So I think what falls within our remit is spending to assist disabled people or those receiving reserve benefits with barriers into long-term employment. So we estimate around 80% of the employability budget falls within our remit, and that's according to our legislation. So then we just apply that to the budget that we are given by the government and roll that forward rather than uprating it at the moment.
Right, but why do you think it's going to fall from 73 million this year and be at 70 million for 5 years in a row?
Yeah, sorry, so the fall from 73 to 70 is the 3 million is the Fair Start Scotland, but that scheme is being phased out, so it's been entirely sort of consumed into No One Left Behind, and then we run it flat from then onwards. So this year we've got 70 million in 25-26. The 73 million is broken down by 3 million in Fair Start Scotland and then 70 in No One Left Behind. And when that Fair Start Scotland fades away, then you're just left with the 70 million.
And there's no inflationary component?
We don't apply anything to that at the moment, just based on the discussions we've had with the government on that and what we've seen in previous years in terms of spending on it.
Okay, thanks. And the other one thing is just, I'm curious, it's in 311 on page 39. It's regarding your projection on public sector employment. Now, since the pandemic, there's been a 42,000 increase in the public sector workforce. 25,000 of those are in the NHS, 17,000 obviously are not, therefore. But you're projecting, despite the public sector reform, which I understand one of the things we'll be doing is looking at the size of workforces, especially with, for example, digitisation, etc., AI, you name it. But you're talking about only a 0.1% reduction in the current year and 0.3% from 26-27 onwards. So I'm just wondering if you can...
That's largely, what we do in that is largely take pay policy and the kind of the public sector employment data, and then just slide that forward based upon what we think public sector pay will be within that, and that's across the entire public sector in Scotland. So that's not, because we don't have the detailed, we don't have any detail from the government on what their specific targets would be about, say, changes in employment. That's largely just essentially a forecast that is a mechanical forecast to help us make our tax forecast. So it's not a judgment on government have told us that they plan to remove X number of jobs, and we've incorporated that.
Sure.
It's going the other way.
Yeah. So is this something you might expect to see in the MTFS, for example?
Yeah, I mean, I guess one of the things we've spoken about a lot is it's okay having pay policy, but it'd be nice to have a workforce policy that underpins that, and that would be the sort of thing you would expect to see in a medium-term strategy.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Are there any further points your team would like to
No, that was really
raise
good.
at this point? No? Well, thank you very much once again for your evidence this morning. It's very much appreciated. We will now take a short break, some 5 minutes before moving to the next session. Thank you. The second item on our agenda today is to take evidence on the cost effectiveness of Scottish public inquiries. I therefore welcome to the meeting Stephen McGowan, Deputy Crown Agent, Litigation, Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service, and David Kennedy, General Secretary of the Scottish Police Federation. We'll have your written submissions, so we'll move straight to questions from the committee. And I have to say, what a hard-hitting submission you have provided, Mr Kennedy. I actually find it really refreshing in terms of how direct it is actually with regard to the issues that we are addressing as a committee. So you say that you want to raise concerns regarding the escalating unsustainable burden that public inquiries are placing on policing in Scotland, and that the current situation is critical. And you mentioned 6 major public inquiries ongoing in Scotland. Sheikh Ubayo, Emma Caldwell, Scottish Child Abuse, Scottish Hospitals, Scottish COVID Inquiry, and El Jamel in NHS Tayside. And you say, taken collectively, they represent a crippling financial and operational burden on a service already facing the most acute resourcing crisis in over a decade. So I'm just wondering, I've got a lot, I can continue in this vein, but I'm quite keen that you have an opportunity to speak directly to the record, Mr Kennedy.
Thank you. Yes, the amount of and the sheer task that public inquiry places on the police service, resource-wise, is quite extraordinary. And what I've certainly seen since taking up my post and being in this federation for nearly 20 years is there's never any budget set aside for the police service to take up these inquiries. And the police service in Scotland since 2013 obviously losing the amount of money they have off their budget and the reform that has then taken place has had a knock-on effect. And if we take the Sheikh Ubayo inquiry, I mean, it's currently sitting at £25 million is the cost to the police service. Now, on that figure alone, that would, on a light scale, give you 500 police officers. And with the current resourcing levels within Police Scotland, it is having an absolute detrimental effect on policing. A recent FOI into G Division, which is the biggest division within Scotland, which is in the Glasgow area, showed that one detective inspector is currently sitting with 176 rape inquiries of him alone. That's what he's in charge of as the SIO. Now, 176, if you take off his rest days, you're lucky if he's investigating 2 days at a time for any of those. So that burden, that shows you the knock-on effect that inquiries can have on the day-to-day running of policing. And that £25 million for that one inquiry, we've been told the Scottish Hospitals inquiry, there was 60 detectives at one point dealing with that inquiry. So that shows you the resource that's used. Going back to the Sheikh Ubayo inquiry, they currently have 17 officers, and that ranges from constable to superintendent, who are involved in dealing with that inquiry at this time. And that's not those who are giving evidence at the inquiry, that's just those who are in the background, making sure that they are getting the statements, getting the documentation and everything required for the public inquiry. And that itself shows you it's a lot of money. I think it currently sits at £5 million for that personnel cost for their salaries. So that is the...
Also said that to believe that public safety hasn't been compromised would be foolhardy.
Yep.
And you go on to say that officer well-being is being totally neglected.
Well, it is. We have senior investigating officers who are off sick now. They're not. We have ones we're dealing with at the moment who won't be back, and it's due to the amount of inquiries that they're dealing with, the amount of death that they're potentially seeing, and the knock-on effect is when you have so many officers going on to a day shift role doing inquiries, that leaves the operational role short, and that is what's happening at the moment. So these officers that are left, it's not the public inquiry that's necessarily causing that. The officer in the public inquiry is probably getting an easier time because they have set tasks to do for the inquiry. It's the ones that are left in operational roles that are in dire straits because the workload is unbelievable. And when I saw the figure for 176 for an SIO, which is a detective inspector, I thought that's just inconceivable the stress that that person must be under.
Argue about this in a number of areas, that the police should get additional resources, and I think there'll be strong support for that. But but you've pointed out that no additional funding has been made available to cover the costs incurred, and that's obviously a major concern for the police, particularly with new inquiries about to begin. Emma Caldwell, for example. So we're obviously looking at the cost effectiveness of public inquiries. What, from the Federation's point of view, do you think should be done to make these inquiries more cost effective?
Well, sure, I think they may have to set proper budgets out at the beginning and actually ask, before they do that, have an impact assessment on the agencies that are going to be involved in those inquiries, and actually ask them, how is this inquiry going to affect the operational day-to-day running of your service? Because they don't ask them that. You know, that they take on the inquiry, and the police is the police will always say we can manage. It's in every police officer that a can-do organisation, the people within the organisation are can-do people. But the reality is, what we're seeing now is they can't do it. They'll say they can do it, and they'll do their best to do it, but it's having a knock-on effect that they probably don't realise, and now it's catching up. So an impact assessment would allow government and whoever's setting up the public inquiry, if it's coming from government, to look at it and say, right, what do we need to make sure this service isn't going to be impacted? My concern at the moment is that we're going to have more public inquiries in 10 years' time because of items and cases that have been missed now, while we're taking people off the operational side of policing to help with the public inquiries that are ongoing.
Yes, so it becomes a self-perpetuating kind of increasing cycle now. Mr McGowan, basically you said that the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service approach to public inquiries is that one Deputy Crown Agent coordinates our response to ensure that there is an overview in the way in which we deal with inquiries and to provide consistency in our response. And you say that costs incurred by COPFS in relation to public inquiries come together into one budget line to enable better control of costs. So how are these costs actually being controlled?
So our work in public inquiries is like all of our work, it's demand driven. So when a public inquiry is set up, we will discuss and engage with that public inquiry at an early stage what they want from us. They will then come to us formally and ask for that, and we'll provide that information. That is provided by senior prosecutors who are subject matter experts in the area. We're demand driven. When the inquiry asks, we will cooperate with the inquiry, and we'll give the inquiry what the inquiry requires of us. But we're demand led as far as that's concerned.
Led, then there isn't really any cost controls, is there?
Well, there's cost controls in the sense that we have a team who deal with these matters, but they flex across the various inquiries that there are. They can work between inquiries, and we're developing an expertise ourselves in the law and practice of public inquiries. So that is a cost control in itself. But it's not for us to cost control a public inquiry, which is scrutinising us.
But do you think there should be cost controls? I mean, Mr Kennedy, for example, has made a couple of helpful suggestions. I mean, every other area of the public sector has got a kind of budget and is expected to deliver on that budget, whether it's the police, whether it's the NHS, whether it's local government. But it seems to be that inquiries are almost open-ended, and they can just, Cheikh Wabai's went on, 6 years, for example. Do you not feel that there should be some kind of, at the outset, there should be an assessment of what the opportunity cost will be, for want of a better phrase, i.e. if you're taking resources away from the police, to put into an inquiry which may or may not come to, some kind of conclusion in a few years, and may or may not actually have recommendations, and may or may not be implemented. Should there not be a comparison between that cost and there is implication for the Crown Office Prosecution Service as well, relative to other areas where public money should be spent? Is that not something you think should take place?
I mean, that's really a question for Scottish ministers. It's Scottish ministers that set these inquiries up.
Your opinion as an organisation. I mean, you know, I mean, I mean, what I like about, I actually think you've got a very good submission as well. But I have to say, you know, Mr. Kennedy's is very direct and very robust. And as a committee, we're trying to make things better for the Scottish taxpayer, but also so that people who actually want to see public inquiries get justice delivered as they see it. Timelessly, because I mean, how does it help anyone if an inquiry runs on for 5 or 10 years, costs hundreds of millions of pounds, and may have recommendations which a year or two after they've been made may not even have been implemented? So surely it's in everyone's interest to have that, and that's why I'm keen to have your view on it.
So the process at the start of the inquiry, when ministers set it up, is that they should adjust and set terms of reference. The terms of reference, if the terms of reference are sharp and focused, should take us to the place that you suggest. Again, if once the inquiry is set up, we work with it and we'll support it insofar as we can. We're all for transparency and public accountability. But as far as how it's set up and the budgets of the inquiry, it's a matter for the inquiry. If you send up an inquiry which is independent, it's independent.
But surely COPFS have a view, because you know, in paragraph 19 of your own submission, you say, prior to setting up with the Sheku Bayo inquiry, COPFS and the then Lord Advocate were of the view that there were matters in relation to the circumstances of Mr Bayo's death that would be out with the scope of a fatal acts inquiry, and therefore there would be benefit in a public inquiry being held. So you were part of the recommendation that it should be an inquiry. So as part of that recommendation, you know, in terms of setting out terms of reference, should there not be kind of some kind of, you know, recommendation that you would want it to report, say, within a couple of years, which to normal people doesn't seem unreasonable, and with a certain cost implication, as opposed to, what is it, 50 million overall, including 25 million from the police side?
So the Bayo inquiry was unusual in that sense, in that there were matters in relation to the death that couldn't be dealt with within the constraints of the legislation that governs fatal accident inquiries, round about what happened post-incident, etc. And those were matters which had to be addressed for the purposes of dealing with the state's Article 2 right to life procedural obligations. So it needed something more than a fatal accident inquiry. That's why that submission was made by the then Lord Advocate, and that's what we did. I think you come to a fundamental philosophical point as to what does independence mean. If you set up an independent inquiry and then you control its budget and you say it can only operate for 2 years, that's a constraint round about the work that the inquiry can do. So,
well, does it not just mean that you actually have to focus a bit more than just look at every single potential thread on an almost exponential way? So, for example, what Mr Kennedy's submission says is that the current inquiry model is not effective. Many inquiries become protracted and unfocused without statutory timelines or budget oversight, cost spiral and impact is delayed. Would you not agree with that?
You control a public inquiry's work as a minister when you set it up by its terms of reference. So again, I come back to all of that stuff that can be done at the start by controlling the terms of reference of the inquiry and setting the terms of reference tightly, if that's what your objective is at the start.
And do you think there should be more transparency? Because again, Mr Kennedy's submission, he says the public and contributing participants are rarely informed about inquiry costs, remits or extensions. Do you feel there should be more information provided? For example, you know, interim recommendations in an inquiry, so people can see where have we gone over the last 5 or 6 years, whatever it might be in an inquiry.
Some public inquiries do take that approach, and they do work on a modular basis where they'll come up with conclusions and recommendations at the end. The Scottish Child Abuse Inquiry is a good example of that, where as they split each piece of work off, they will publish reports of their findings at that point in time. As for the financial costs of that and what they've been doing, again, that's really a matter for the inquiries themselves. And as I said, I'm all for transparency and accountability of their budgets. I think how they publicise that is maybe part of the issue here, because their costs are available. They do publish costs, as far as I'm aware, in their annual reports and accounts.
Is that not a bit like marking your own homework, though? I mean, again, what Mr Kennedy said, and I'll let Mr Kennedy back in, obviously, as well. In a minute, he said independence is essential, but it must be balanced with accountability to ensure a framework that ensures value for public money.
that's that philosophical question I've described.
Well, it's not a philosophical question. It's a, you know, I mean, Mr. Kennedy has given direct reference to the fact that, you know, the police service is under strain because officers are having to be directed in significant numbers into inquiries, and as a result, other areas of what they're trying to do may be adversely affected. And the overall impact in terms of the public, any benefit that might come from an inquiry could be effectively, you know, negated by the loss of service that the police are able to provide elsewhere. Is that not something that we should really be looking at in terms of these inquiries?
It is a matter you should be looking at. It's a difficult matter for me to comment upon, though. As I've described, it's a matter, if you set up an independent inquiry, that inquiry is independent. If you then start trying to set limits round about what it can do and what it can't do as it's going on, then it becomes less independent. You get that right at the start by setting its terms of reference. The Act allows that to be done in Section 5 of the Inquiries Act. If you set the terms of reference tightly, then it shouldn't be allowed then to wander into other areas.
So should there be a higher bar in terms of public inquiries? Because there's more public inquiries in Scotland and the UK than there has been ever before. And it seems to be that you know, what would have perhaps had a, you know, something less radical than a public inquiry is now just going to public inquiries. Do you think there should be, we should look again at, you know, that the advice that ministers are given in terms of public inquiries and when one should be launched and when one shouldn't?
As I said, we're subject to public inquiries. You're subject to scrutiny to public inquiries. Your question is really with respect one for Scottish ministers. It's not one for me to.
But they take advice. They take advice. As the Sheikh Ubai inquiry, that was launched because of advice from your office and the Lord Advocate.
It wasn't solely launched for that reason. That was one of the factors which I'm sure they took into account, and that advice was given for the reasons I've explained, that there were factors which we considered were necessary to be looked at about the various matters I've described. Okay. Which were required to look at in terms of the state's Article 2 obligations. So that was legal advice and there were legal obligations that the Scottish ministers had to fulfil in terms of that obligation, and that was what was behind that advice.
Okay, Mr Kennedy, you've talked about in cost monitoring, said there are no enforceable mechanisms for monitoring costs, which leads to unchecked overruns, and you advocate for independent financial oversight, maximum inquiry durations unless formally extended by Parliament, and annual public reporting on progress and spend.
Yes. Well, there isn't any. I mean, the inquiries tend to run away with themselves financially. And when that runs away with itself, and in Stephen's defence, I don't think Crown Office would have a control on that. I think it would be it has to be set up right from the beginning to say these are the mechanisms that will control the inquiry, and we don't have any financial constraints on that. And what happens is, as the inquiry runs away with itself, what then happens is, certainly for the police service, it runs away because it can't stop what it's doing. It has to continue to be part of that, and that's where your costs start to mount up. And yes, I believe if there's mechanisms put in place, you also mentioned that having another approach to it. There may be other tiers that could be put in place where they would look at it and say, you know, this is how it is going to work now, rather than the overarching, the way public inquiries work, where for me, they do tend to spread and spread. And there doesn't seem to be that point to say, can the inquiry actually, can we afford to do this in this current financial predicament that we're in, or is there a cheaper way of doing it and a better way of doing it?
Well, sorry, on that, you've talked about in your submission alternatives to full public inquiries. So, for example, you've talked about models in Canada, New Zealand and Ireland, where inquiry frameworks are more proportionate and cost managed.
Yeah, New Zealand probably the best example. New Zealand actually looked at their public inquiries in 2013, and it was the Inquiries Act of 2013. And they changed how they dealt with them. They had a more broader sense in looking at inquiries, and they still had public inquiries. They then had government inquiries and they had royal commissions, and they have tailored it more into the cost effectiveness and what they're actually trying to achieve at the other side of that. Canada and Ireland are similar to the UK. There are positives and negatives that you'll get within what they have, but each of these countries are looking to see how they can better get cost effectiveness of these inquiries, and I believe that's where Scotland needs to be. We have to look at a better model where we actually don't have a public inquiry taking 6 years. We're going to currently be running a public inquiry for something that happened over 20 years ago. And the question will be is, what is getting left behind while that takes place? And that is my biggest concern at the moment. The Emma Caldwell inquiry, from what I'm getting told, will be probably one of the biggest inquiries we've ever had. And if we look at what's been in the last public inquiries, I've got a real concern that in 20 years' time we'll be back with a public inquiry to look at what happened 20 years ago.
Now, an inquiry such as an Emma Caldwell inquiry or Shiku Bayu takes place, there's a real impact on police resources. If it's El Jamel, for example, that'll be NHS resources. Do you think there's an argument, whether we have the same model of inquiry or not, for a completely ring-fenced fund to pay for public inquiries that does not impact on specific service budgets?
Absolutely. And that's what we don't have. We don't have it anything ring-fenced for it. We don't look and say, how much is it going to cost and the impact, what's the impact going to be on that organisation?
And Mr McGowan, COPFS, is that something you feel would be a sensible approach?
Anything that helps budget-wise is of assistance, and we'd be happy to work with government on that. The public inquiries are a pressure for us. It's something that every year we go into the discussions on the budget and say we've got these inquiries to deal with, but we don't get separate funding for it, so it's a pressure every year.
And just lastly, from me, because obviously colleagues want to come in terms of implementing recommendations, as I touched on earlier, that's been a real bugbear, I think, for many people. And I think there was something like 3,250 recommendations have been, come forward from 54 completed inquiries in the UK since 1990, and as we know, hundreds of them just don't seem to be implemented. Mr McGowan, Mr Kennedy suggested that there should be statutory deadlines for publication of implementation, annual reporting to Parliament on progress, and independent post-implementation review, which, for example, took place in the Jersey. In the Jersey child abuse inquiry, they did have a post-review 2 years later. Is that something that the COPFS would support as well?
In principle, there's no reason why we can't do that. It comes with more expense because you're then reviewing what's happened at the inquiry, but in principle there's no difficulty with that. I think the other
but then again, it's about cost effectiveness, not just cost. There's no a lot of point in having an inquiry and making recommendations if nothing happens. I mean, sorry to cut across you, but one of the things, for example, that that Professor Cameron in our first evidence session said was that some of the recommendations that we made in the Jersey inquiry were made in the first inquiry into child abuse in 1945, still not been implemented. So
it comes with that cost. But in principle, absolutely not. There are ways and means of doing that. The other observation I would have is that some of the inquiries, when they make their recommendations, they are just that, their recommendations. They need to be implemented, and that then needs government to take a view, and government will have to take a broad view in terms of budgets. So, it's to what extent does government and the Parliament, when they vote for budgets, want to take that into consideration when they consider the recommendations. But in principle, there are ways of examining that.
So is there anything specifics that COPFS would suggest in terms of improving this public inquiry system?
I've suggested in my note that there are other ways of doing it that are non-statutory inquiries, and I've given some examples of ones that we see have worked in the past.
Yeah, I think the issue, of course, is now that we're in a situation whereby, unless it's a judge-led inquiry, the public who are individuals who are clamouring for inquiries feel they've been almost shortchanged. I think that's one of the issues that we face with that. Was that something?
I mean, that's the tension. I've given the examples of the two reports that were into the Chokar case. They were quick, they were very effective, and having been about long enough to remember the impact of them in COPFS, there was a fairly radical change in how we did things at that time as a result. I've also given the more recent example of Dame Eilish Angelini's work and the cooperation that they've given. Speaking for my organisation, when we're providing material and assistance to an inquiry, we're not necessarily doing that because they have the force of law and they can compel that evidence from us. We're doing that because we welcome the transparency and accountability that they bring. So we would cooperate with these inquiries in any event. There's a very small group of material where there might be other balancing rights that would have that compulsator might be required. But
in Mr Chokar, that took a year from 2001.
It was about that. It was
Yeah.
they reported the calendar year after they were set up.
Yeah.
I can't recall now whether it was within the 12 months or not, but certainly in a much speedier
So, Mr
pace.
Kennedy, you feel we've lost our way in public inquiries and it's time for a reset?
Yeah, absolutely. I genuinely believe we have lost our way and we need to get that back. And I think the point you make about recommendations is fundamental. You know, if we're not public, we publish the recommendations, we should be making sure that these are put in place if they're there and they're found to be correct. Because we don't want to be here in 45, 50 years' time looking at the same problems that somebody's recommended 40 or 50 years ago. That would just be foolhardy.
I don't know they want to be here in 5 years now.
No,
years,
absolutely,
but
absolutely.
What you mean? Okay, I'm going to open up this session to colleagues around the table. Craig, to be followed by Michelle.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. Mr McGowan, just in relation to your submission, you reference the Angelini inquiry and make the point that non-statutory inquiries don't have powers of compulsion. How important is it that inquiries have the power of compulsion, given that in that example it seemed that people cooperated with the inquiry without it?
We would cooperate. I can only speak for my organisation, but we would cooperate with any inquiry that's set up in whatever manner it's set up, because, as I've said, we welcome that transparency and accountability. We recognise that as a public authority we're there to be scrutinised, and that that scrutiny can lead to improvements in the way we do things.
In respect of the Chikabayo inquiry, you say that the reason as to why we didn't pursue the fatal accident inquiry were that there were matters relating to the death that would be out with the scope of a fatal accident inquiry. What would those matters typically have been?
So they were to do with post-incident actings and some of the cultural matters in the organisations that dealt with the response to the death, including my own. Those would not typically be things that could, within the statutory framework for fatal accident inquiries, be dealt with. A fatal accident inquiry looks about finding what the fact of the death was and how that happened and what caused the death and what might have prevented it, but not those wider surrounding issues, which were issues that were part of what caused that inquiry to be set up.
Could there potentially be some kind of hybrid model where the scope of a fatal accident inquiry could be slightly enlarged in order to prevent the default position, therefore, becoming a public inquiry?
Because the Fatal Accident Inquiry is bound by the terms of the Fatal Accident Inquiries Act 2016 as it is at the moment, which is in pretty similar terms in terms of its scope to that of the 1976 Act, which predated it.
And in paragraph 21, you make reference to the inquiry into Surjit Singh Chokar, where the inquiries were set up in 2000 and reported in 2001, led by Sir Anthony Campbell. Have you got any insight as to why they managed to do that so expeditiously when other investigations into similar situations seem to roll on for years and years?
I wasn't involved in them at the time. I know that the methodology was to gather the documents and then speak to the witnesses, and they did that without the formality of public hearings about the matter. I'm not sure I can give much else given how long ago it was, but you can see what Dame Eilish is doing with her inquiries at the moment, which is following a similar pattern of speaking to witnesses but without the public nature of the hearings, that it's able to work its way through that more quickly.
And just to the point that the convener made in terms of public confidence, it seems to be that public inquiries have become the gold standard and that anything less the public would seem to be distrustful of. But yet there are examples there on the public record where we seem to have satisfied public confidence without going down the public inquiry route. Whose responsibility is it to effectively try and sell these alternatives to the public, and particularly the victims, who actually may end up getting, if the reverse of justice delayed is justice denied, they may end up getting answers and justice quicker, which would presumably help in these circumstances the grieving process?
I hesitate to go back to Scottish ministers because they set these inquiries up. But I think it's incumbent on everyone. There is always clamour for a public inquiry. We hear that a lot. The question is whether or not we've looked through the other options before we go to the public inquiries. And I do say that's incumbent on everyone to make those suggestions as to whether that's needed or not. It can be difficult for an organisation like mine, because if you take the 2 inquiries we've just discussed, we're the subject of those inquiries, so it can be difficult for the organisation which is about to be scrutinised to be out in the public saying there's a different way of doing this without it looking as if we're trying to avoid that scrutiny. But I think it's non-statutory inquiries are a tool in the armoury that we should remember when it comes to an incident which we might think about an inquiry on.
Now, obviously, both of your organisations would quite legitimately, I think, probably brought into the process of a public inquiry probably quite frequently because of the nature of your organisations. It has been recommended that a body is established somewhere that actually deals with public inquiries rather than each one having to reinvent the wheel, I think it was described. Would that aid you in terms of your engagement with it? You'd be dealing perhaps with a constant secretariat that would mean that you're not having to, rebuild relations each time another public inquiry comes along. Perhaps Mr McGowan and then Mr Kennedy on that.
Yes, we'd be happy to work with an organisation like that. I can see the advantages of it, yes.
Mr Kennedy.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I think we have to look. I mean, the question about the fatal accident inquiry, that scope being made bigger, will change the Act.
Yeah, well, yeah.
That's what we need to do.
Yeah.
We need to make it better, because I think the fatal accident inquiries are better, and that's what I would be asking to happen. Change it, make it better. We have that opportunity. We should be doing it.
And obviously, the other issue that you've raised, Mr Kennedy, is the huge cost to Police Scotland. Presumably, in an ideal world, what you would be asking for is recompense from the government, regardless of whether or not it was an inquiry that perhaps found shortcomings on behalf of the police. You would just be hoping that that would be underwritten. And if it was the case that that was underwritten for Police Scotland, wouldn't that open the doors to everybody effectively receiving the equivalent of legal aid for whatever costs they incur, both legal and manpower costs?
I believe it absolutely should. The whole point of the inquiry is to get to the facts and get to the truth and actually find out what happened and to stop it happening again. And you are sometimes crippling organisations by when the inquiry comes on, because there'll be organisations out there that would probably wish to be in some of these public inquiries but financially cannot afford to do it. And it is a financial burden on organisations, so absolutely, I think if the cost is there and everybody knows that money is set aside, you will get more people willing to be part of it, and hopefully it would be done in a more timely manner as well.
And there is a sense that ministers are effectively passing the buck when they put in place a public inquiry. They want it off the desk as quick as possible. The report may end up on the desk and gathered dust 10 years later. But do you think if the government, Scottish ministers, were basically having to foot the entire bill for a public inquiry, they might think twice before instituting one and actually be more discriminating as to what should go to a public inquiry?
Well, ultimately they are footing the bill. It's just how it's hidden or how it's not shown within the public finances. Because ultimately the organisation, and if it's a public organisation, be it be police or NHS, they're going to foot the bill because they won't be able to do something at the other side. And we have to recognise that when we're setting up these inquiries. But for the organisations at the time, they have to be given the money because there is a knock-on and negative impact that it has on their organisation.
And obviously, in terms of you've mentioned the impact on operational policing. All of us around this table understand the huge pressure the police are under. They've got the issue in relation to gangland warfare and everything else at the moment. So I fully recognise the pressure you're under. In terms of the impact that this is having on the operational capabilities of the police, have you raised this specifically with ministers in the past in relation to the points you raised with the committee in relation to public inquiries?
Not in reference to this inquiry, but we will be raising it with them. We have raised issues though about finances. We have raised issues in the past about. I have asked the Cabinet Secretary for Justice about how the next public inquiry, the Emma Caldwell inquiry, where's the money coming from for the police? We have asked if the police can be funded for their part in these inquiries when it's operational impact that it's going to have on it, and I haven't had an answer for that.
You've not had an answer. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Michelle, to be followed by John.
Good morning, both. Thanks for joining us. Actually, just following up firstly from the point that Craig Hoy was asking about there, it'd be useful for me to understand a little more, Mr Kennedy, about the direct engagement you've had with government to express your concerns about costs. You mentioned the Sheikh Bayou inquiry. I mean, that seems to be out there in terms of how long it's been running and the cost incurred. But and I know you weren't in place there, but did you, at the start of that inquiry, express concerns about the potential implications of cost and your operational challenges that would result therein? And it would be useful if you could just walk us through how many meetings have been had, how frequently you've raised your concerns with government. And also, you mentioned the Justice Secretary, but I mean, there was quite the kind of media campaign by the lawyer representing the family of Sheikh Bayou to have the scope increased, and it was actually the Deputy First Minister who came out and said, no, we're not going to do that. So I wonder also whether you've had any engagement with the Deputy First Minister.
So in regards to the early interventions, obviously that were made, I wasn't in post then, so my predecessors certainly had various conversations with, and any time they met with government, I can assure you, any time you meet with ministers, costs and money's probably at the top of the...
I do appreciate you weren't in post, but it'd be useful to kind of even anecdotally from yourself to understand, well, where did these conversations go? Because if concerns were being raised as to the operational impact on your kind of core duties, did anything arise from that? Were they simply noted or noted and put in a box somewhere not to be looked at again?
Things have arisen from them since these conversations take place, in the sense that they will say that there's more budget given to the police service and probably push back some of that in Police Scotland. But the reality is we only have to look at the police numbers to know that their concerns haven't been taken into cognisis, because when we once had 17,234, we're now at 16,500 police officers. So the concerns are raised every single time we meet with Cabinet. Single time we meet with ministers, we raise money and finances. Now, I know there's not a pot of gold somewhere and there's not a pot of money somewhere for government, because all public sectors will be feeling this pain and feeling it. But from the police service in general, we always raise that we have tried our best. We've had 200 million taken out of the budget, which we always raise with ministers. And the reform that's taken place and continues to take place within policing is, for all the public sectors, has certainly been the most. But with the public inquiries, we have written and asked that where can money be put aside to assist with the police, with the legal costs that will certainly come from it. That's not including, obviously, the operational costs that would then come in.
So those letters you refer to where you've written, have you had responses to...
It was in reference to Emma Caldwell, and we've been given a meeting to discuss it with the CAVSEC. As I said, we don't seem to be getting anywhere. I think it's the easiest way to say that, because the budgets that have been produced for policing are not enough for what policing has to produce at the end of the day.
Okay. And Mr McGowan, I wanted to ask yourself, one of the areas we've touched on in this query is the potential, real or otherwise, perception of a conflict for interest. Have you had any initial engagement? I noticed in point 5 in your submission in regard to what you refer to as the Rangers case, and you say the form and nature of this inquiry has yet to be confirmed, but have you had discussions with government as to the nature of that inquiry, given the significant potential for interest if it was, say, somebody from the Scottish legal fraternity that's relatively small, and many lawyers go into the Crown Office and vice versa? Have any discussions taken place?
We've had early discussions because we require to keep them up to date with what's been going on with the litigation and with the current inquiry, which is ongoing, which needs to be cleared before that inquiry starts. Ultimately, those are decisions, again, for ministers to make. It's not something, again, as the organisation which will be inquired into, there's a limit to what we can do and say about some of that.
Of course, but surely you would be pushing for, to protect reputationally yourself, to your view, and that I'm interested if it is your view, that it surely must be someone ideally external to Scotland altogether, because of the potential conflict of interest, given, the Crown Office's role in the Rangers case?
I'm not sure I would accept there's a potential conflict of interest. It's not our decision at the end of the day, but I'm not sure there's a potential conflict of interest for example, a judge from Scotland hearing that case. Judges in Scotland hear cases that Crown Office bring every single day. We're the biggest litigator in Scotland. They hear cases against the Scottish Government every single day. And you can read in the media every day that they don't always rule in their favour. So I don't necessarily think it needs to be someone from out with the jurisdiction, but at the end of the day, ministers will make the decision that ministers make, and we will cooperate with that.
I'm not necessarily focusing on this, it's around the decision-making processes of not only should an inquiry be set up, but the nature of that in terms of basically good governance. That's why I'm asking this question. But I don't have anything else, Convener.
Okay, well, thank you very much. John, to follow by Liz.
Thank you, Convener. Mr McGowan, you've previously mentioned independence and how it was a bit of a philosophical question, which I kind of accept. I mean, I think you suggested that if the terms of reference were sharper and focused at the beginning, that would solve the problem, or might. But what about the idea that we say at the beginning, you know, along with that, and I take the point that this should all be fixed at the beginning, not halfway through, you know, we want this inquiry in 2 years and it's going to cost £5 million, and these are the terms of reference. Would that be taking away from the independence, do you think?
So you would have to decide what you want from your inquiry at the start. And that, I think that's the basic point that I'm making. That's what the Act allows at the moment. If you say it's going to take 2 years and it's going to cost £5 million, that may come with compromises. And if those are the compromises that ministers and the inquiry chair accept that they have to make, we'll work with that. Public inquiries till now have been looked at as a root and branch review of everything, which is perhaps why we end up where we end up. But in principle, I absolutely accept the point that you make. But it comes with a compromise. So you've got your pure independence, which is that the inquiry controls everything. The inquiry controls budget, and the inquiry controls where it goes. And you have a slightly different model that you're suggesting, and there's no reason why that can't work. But again, you're back to your public confidence of the people appearing before the inquiries and how you balance all of that out. None of that is insurmountable, I don't suggest, but it's a different model from the one that perhaps we've operated on thus far.
And yet it is where other professions, I mean, a teacher has 50 minutes or whatever with a set of pupils and does the best they can in that 50 minutes. And I mean, myself as an accountant, you know, you have to do an audit within 3 months or whatever it might be for a fixed fee. So, and they're still in, well, the auditors, I think, are considered independent. So it does seem to be possible to do that kind of thing. But it does seem when we get the legal profession involved, they don't like that kind of...
I mean, I'm a member of the legal profession, but I work for an organisation which gets a budget every year, and we've got an ever-expanding amount of cases to do, and we need to do it. So we need to find ways to do it. We need to find those efficiencies ourselves every year. So, I mean, the discipline you describe is not something that's unfamiliar to me, certainly in my organisation. Again, I go back to it is perhaps a philosophical question, but I see nothing about the model that you're suggesting that couldn't be made to work. It's...
you may or may not want to answer this, but sorry, my microphone's not on. You may or may not want. Sorry, bad start. Yeah, as I said, you may or may not want to answer this, but when I put that to Lord Hardy, he said he just wouldn't do it if that was the conditions.
I mean, that's a matter for him. I don't think I can. I don't think I can gainsay that. Yes. And again, it comes down to what does independence mean. Do you want a judicially-led inquiry, and what will be the conditions for that?
And on that point, you know, because it's been suggested we could have, if it was, say, child abuse, then some kind of specialist in child care could be chairing or it could be a panel or a judge. I mean, do you have any thoughts on that?
The choice of chair is a matter, again, for ministers, and I keep going back to that. Judges tend to be chosen because, A, they're seen as independent, B, they have a background in ensuring fairness, they have a background in making complex decisions and writing those up. That's the skill set that a judge brings with them. That's perhaps why they are chosen and why they're reached for. The Act also, and the rules that goes with the current Act, also impose various obligations about fairness, those powers to compel witnesses, to compel evidence. So these are all matters that lawyers are familiar with. That's why perhaps we end up in this criticism that it's legalistic. We set up a forum, we have it chaired by a judge, we impose these rules which are very much like a courtroom or a tribunal, and it's perhaps inevitable that you end up with a legalistic format. There's also things in the rules that if someone's going to be criticised, they need to be warned, and the committee, I'm sure, are familiar with all that. Again, it is a fundamentally legal and legalistic process that we have in these inquiries at the moment. Yeah. So that's perhaps why judges are chosen. It's perhaps why we end up with a legalistic process. It is.
I mean, that specific point on the warning letters, that has come up before. We've taken evidence, and I think there were suggestions that we could make savings. Mr Kennedy, advantage having a judge running it, or a panel, or a specialist?
That Stephen's made is correct, I think, because you have a judge, then it does take on that legal environment. We've seen it in other areas of medical inquiries, where if it's a doctor doing it, they not necessarily need a lawyer to be there because, doctors, but then what happens is they tend to only want to listen to the doctors and not necessarily somebody who's a lay member. So it's getting that rounded approach that if an inquiry was to be set up with the appropriate, and you're absolutely right, I think it has to be the appropriate person that understands the area of business or that area where the mistakes have been made, and that might assist. And those who come in as well, because invariably what happens in the costs that are associated with the public inquiries is because the legal teams then require the experts to come in, and then they cost money, and then it just rolls on.
Yes.
And I think if you're a way to control that better and make sure those people were more independent, then that might be a better way of running it.
But if the judges all said, we said to them, right, you've got 2 years and £5 million, and they all say they're not taking part, we're kind of stuck then, aren't we?
We just have to find somebody else.
Okay. Right. To go on to some other issues, yes, the idea that came up from yourself or your paper, I think, Mr McGowan, that you could start an inquiry, not a statutory public inquiry, and then it could become one. I was just quite interested in that concept. Does that mean there's a lot of duplication? Would that actually mean the costs were higher in the long run?
It would depend how it's done. So provisions made for that in the Inquiries Act, I think it's section 15. So you could start the inquiry with that, with less formality, without the full panoply of the independent public inquiry, and if there was a requirement to do so, and then you can convert it. If the inquiry chair agrees to do that, I think is the way it's phrased in the Act, then you wouldn't necessarily have to go back and revisit. It would all depend on the facts and circumstances, I dare say. But if the reason to convert it, I would anticipate, would be because you needed those powers of compulsion that a public inquiry under the 2005 Act requires. If that's the reason that you're converting it, and if it's heard evidence quite effectively up to that point, you wouldn't necessarily have to start from scratch. So the work that you'd done wouldn't be put in a cupboard and ignored. It would be converting it for a particular purpose, which was to compel someone who otherwise wasn't going to cooperate with the inquiry. So it's probably a suggestion that you could perhaps start some of these inquiries in a non-statutory manner, and if there was a requirement, you still have in your pocket that ability to use those powers of compulsion by converting the inquiry.
And is it your understanding, you mentioned the 2005 Act, which has come up quite a lot. Does this Parliament have the powers to change that Act or amend it or overrule it?
It's an Act of the UK Parliament, so no, there are separate inquiry rules for Scotland, where the Scottish Inquiries Rules 2007.
But could we not do new legislation on public inquiries that would override that Act?
I don't actually know the answer to that
question.
I wouldn't, I would need to go and research that. I wouldn't like to.
That's fine. Mr. Kennedy, I mean, you were saying that the police, and you listed in your paper, I think, is it 6 public inquiries that are going on at the moment.
Yeah.
Do you feel the demands, like questions that are being asked, information, evidence that you're going to provide or your members are going to provide is actually repeating stuff that's already in the public domain. I mean, I'm kind of saying, is there time being wasted going over things that people should already know about?
No, I'm not saying that, because each inquiry will have different elements.
Yeah.
However, the time that's not wasted, the problem is, or the issue is, police officers are very good investigators, and that's why they're probably used more and more, because they go into the investigation part of all these inquiries. And where, for a lot of these inquiries, the police are just doing the investigation part of it to make sure, for some of them, that obviously there's no criminality, but they'll be investigating it to get as much evidence for the inquiry as they can. And for me, it's a purely financial element of that for police officers. There's not necessarily anything else you wouldn't want, but when government have a pot of money and they set up inquiries, they have to realise that that money's not infinite, and it's going to affect the organisations that they're using. And that's where the biggest concern we have at the moment is, because when we set up public inquiries, we're not saying we'll set it up and we'll put £40 million to the side to pay for it. That doesn't happen. No. So we set it up, but that's fine. But then the organisations that are left have got to foot the bill. Yes. And the concern that we are seeing now isn't the concern I've really got, is what I'm seeing operationally at the moment, and the pressure that officers are under, where I really have a fear that we'll have another public inquiry in years to come because of something they've missed and not done because of the pressure they're under at this time.
Yes. So I think somebody else in a question answered, they said there's a sweet spot in the question of, how much more money and effort and time do we put into this for what extra benefit? I mean, I certainly feel that, good word, yeah, good word. Police officers, presumably you are used to working in timescales. I mean,
yes.
As you said, somebody's got so many cases to look at, so they've got to do that within a fixed timescale. I mean, how does that work? If you're asked to investigate something or produce evidence for the public inquiry, that's a fixed timescale, is that right? Your staff have to work to that?
Yes, they'll have fixed timescales. They'll be given tasks to go out and do and gather evidence. But when you're dealing with the human element of it, it's not always that simple, in the sense, if you can't get a hold of somebody, or if you can't get to them and they're not making themselves available, then that's what can drag on the timescales for these inquiries. So that's an element that's there, and I suppose it would have to be at the point where the inquiry says, well, we can't get that evidence, it's not there,
yes, or
we're not able to obtain it.
And what would happen then? Would the police go to the chair of the inquiry and say, could you give us a bit longer, or something?
They would have to, or if the inquiry allows it, they would be looking at, arresting that individual if that was part of an inquiry that somebody was breaking the law where they had to produce evidence. Then they would go to those scales. But yes, they are used to timeframes. But inquiries, for me, because there's no timeframes relatively on them, they can just spiral and spiral and spiral.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's absolutely what I was thinking as well. You raised the suggestion of consulting with public bodies, not just the police, but anyone who'd be involved before an inquiry starts. Can you just expand on what you were meaning by that?
Well, you've got the NHS Tayside inquiry, and so taking the police aside from that, because the police will have a part to play in that, is to go to the NHS and say, we estimate we're going to have to speak to all of these people within your employment. What is the impact is that going to be? Because some of your interviews, when I certainly give interviews for inquiries, they can last hours and days. So that has an impact on that operational side if somebody's an operational person within that, that public body. So they have to look at the impact that is going to have, and that has a value to it. And at the moment, that's not touched upon when we look at inquiries.
And we're discussing it earlier on, because, I mean, that's just going to happen anyway, isn't it? I mean, if it's
well, it would allow government and ministers to say, well, that's going to cost X, so we now need X put aside. Otherwise, it's going to be an operational failure on that public body.
So the aim would be to clarify both the time and the money that are going to be involved. Okay. And the final area, I just want to ask you both, this idea about who's satisfied with a public inquiry, is it your feeling that at the end of public inquiries we've had, that the public are satisfied, or that the victims or their families or whoever's involved, or even the police are satisfied? I mean, I don't know, the Crown Office Service doesn't get satisfied.
The last time there was a public inquiry that gave us recommendations, it was the fingerprint inquiry in 2011, and
Right.
I can't recall. And actually, the recommendations on us were a fairly minor point. They were in two specific areas about training and how we treated certain evidence. So I'm not sure I can answer that question, except to say, you know, we'll read it, we'll make sure we implement things, and we've got a process for doing that. I don't know. I can't really speak for...
Well, I suppose what I'm thinking of, you know, sometimes we see the media interviewing somebody, and this might be down south or elsewhere, after an inquiry, and they're still not satisfied. So, I mean, I get the feeling that there's a risk with public inquiries that either nobody, or at least some of the people, are not satisfied at the end of the process.
I'm sure that's a risk, yes. I recognise the risk that you're talking about. I'm not sure I can say anything more to help you. But,
I think there's a lot of people are not satisfied after public inquiry, the length of time they take, and ultimately the inquiry probably, if it's been a death, you can't bring that person back. No. You're not going to you know, I think the satisfaction the MD can get will be years to come if something doesn't happen, because something that inquiry has put in place that stops it. And it is really, really difficult because emotions are in play with a lot, it's particularly when you're dealing with, if somebody's died, then that's really difficult. So I think the satisfaction, there'll be small wins in public inquiries, but inevitably not necessarily the satisfaction that people absolutely want. I do think there'll be satisfaction in organisations where, if policies are then put in place which actually are they've got to be implemented though, and it is frustrating from organisations when a public inquiry takes place yet they don't see any change, or the change is actually already taking place, because organisations now, I think, as public inquiries go on, are looking to get ahead of the game and think, what am I going to be asked? Right, let's try and do that before it's asked of me. So, because they don't like to be told what to do. So that's why I think there's a lot of dissatisfaction at the end of public inquiries.
Do you think when a public inquiry starts, the public, or like if it's a limited group of people, say victims or their families, they've got unrealistic expectations?
It depends what their expectations are. I think they want answers now. They maybe want somebody to, you know, to be blamed for it. And that doesn't always happen, because public inquiries are not about blaming the person. And I think that's the unrealistic part of it. You know, it goes back to the basic level in employment. When you look at a grievance policy and people want to raise a grievance, invariably they're not going to be satisfied at the end of it, because it's not actually what they want. You know, they may want blood, for want of a better term, and they're not going to get that.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. And again, can I put on the record that I'm representing constituents who are involved in the El Jamel inquiry. Mr Kennedy, you were very powerful twice on the record this morning and once in your report about your concerns that the burden that's placed on the police force could well involve a situation where we might have more public inquiries because something is missed, because of just the pressure that is upon the police force. Can I ask you, what do you think the reason is just now as to why there is an increase in the demand for public inquiries?
Well, there's a dissatisfaction of what people are... There's a dissatisfaction in the public to what people are receiving. You know, people are not receiving for the police, for instance, for me, what they should be receiving for the police service.
And do you think that dissatisfaction is about the police service, or do you think that there's a wider issue here about the delivery of public services in terms of not getting the answers to some of their concerns because the public services let them down? Do you think that's a major influence?
I think, yeah, I believe it is. I think public services have changed. I think people's expectations of what they get now has changed. Now, that's happened because, you know, because of the way society is, people want things tomorrow. They want it now. They're not prepared to wait. So that has a negative impact on the perception that people get. But I think in general terms, people are not satisfied. We only have to look at the police, where you call for the police, nobody's going to come. If you go to the doctors, you can't get to see a GP. You know, look across a lot of our public sectors, people are not satisfied with what they want and what they wish. And we can say some of that's moved on because society's moved on and because of technology, things have moved on. But the reality is, the general public are not satisfied in the services they get.
So if that is correct in the analysis, and I have to say I personally would agree with that analysis, do you think that in order to address some of the concerns about public inquiries, we should actually be addressing some of the concerns about public service delivery? Well,
absolutely, and that's the point. The knock-on effect is absolutely there. Because when we deal with the public inquiry, we're not looking at how that's going to affect the public service that's doing that at the moment. And it's all down, unfortunately, a lot of it is down to finances, but it's down to resourcing and how we deal with it.
And do you think on that basis that there is an increasing complexity about some of the current public inquiries, that it's taking a longer period of time, which is obviously increasing the pressure upon your policing resources? Do you think there is an increasing complexity in that?
There may be an increasing complexity, but I think what happens is organisations actually have to work together more, because what we see is silos appear. And when you go into a public inquiry, organisations will look to defend that organisation rather than actually look and say, how can we actually stop this and work together better to make sure that this doesn't happen again. But the problem you have, because of the way our electoral system works and government work, is people go for their 5-year plan. You know, they're only interested in the 5 years, but the reality is you need a social charter to change it in the next 30 years. Otherwise, we are going through the same revolving door continually. And that's all we're doing. It's the same revolving door, it just keeps coming back. And until we get to that point where we are looking at a 30-year, let's make it better, then we're always going to be here.
Mr McGowan, do you agree with that analysis?
I think the public's demands on public organisations are much greater now than they ever were. I think to a large extent that's quite right. It's appropriate that they're different and have changed over the years. So I absolutely agree with that point.
And within the analysis that you've done of the public inquiries that you have seen, do you feel that there is a growing dissatisfaction with the delivery of public services in this country, and that's what's causing increasing anxiety amongst the public, and frustration, and in some cases anger, because they don't feel that the money that they're paying in terms of tax is delivering the quality of public service that they deserve?
I'm not sure I can speak to that broad picture that you're painting, because I'm one part of the public sector jigsaw in that sense. What we see is that the public's demands are increasing. And as I say, that's quite rightly so. I started at a time when we didn't tell victims anything. If they asked us for a reason why we'd done something, we would say, we can't tell you that. And that was that. And that's it's not that long ago.
Yeah, I just finish on the point that, if it's possible to address some of the concerns about public services or public bodies actually not being able to give the answers that whether it's patients or whether it's victims deserve, then that would be much easier, and it would ease the pressure on the number of public inquiries requested if we could actually get the answers through the public bodies and through government in some cases.
If you could do that in a way that the public are satisfied with, that might ease some of the pressure. There are choices in all of this.
Well, I can think of 3 or 4 public inquiries that wouldn't have happened had these answers been available through the public bodies. But
thank you very much. Just a couple more points from myself. We talked about the opportunity costs on the police, the impact on the services that the police deliver, Mr McGowan, of public inquiries, officers being diverted into inquiries. But also, you helpfully provided a couple of tables with regard to the impact on the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service. And the Shaker-By inquiries cost your office more than £1 million. The child abuse inquiry, more than £4.8 million. So what impact has it had on your services having to deliver these? What is not being done, if you like, because your staff are focusing on these inquiries?
I'm not sure that I would say that something's not being done. And I don't think it's as straightforward as saying that all of the staff who are spending time and working towards these inquiries would be doing work at the sharp end in a court, if I can put it that way. I don't think it's as simple as saying that, because some of these staff would be looking at learning lessons from other things that go on in our world in any event. But it's clear that some of those staff would be deployed in other more operational parts of the business.
But I mean, if it's £1 million a year as it was last year, £968,277, that surely must make it more difficult for you to deliver the other services that COPFS should be delivering.
It's something that we have to take into account, yes. It's as I said earlier, we're demand-driven. That's one of the demands on us at the moment. If we didn't have that demand, we'd be dealing with other matters.
So the Scottish Police Federation has been very open about the impact on it. You've been a wee bit coy about the impact on your own service. So
I don't think I'm being coy. I don't think I'm being coy. We are demand-driven. So crime happens.
They're demand-driven as well, but it's still impacting on our services.
And I think I've said that I haven't said that it hasn't impacted our service. I think I've been.
So how has it impacted on your service? What's been the impact to the public out there? What other services that the COPFS deliver have been delayed, for example?
I can't say anything specific. What I can say is that those staff would be doing something else, which would be. Frontline prosecuting work. They would be doing something else, but not all of them. And I think that's the point, simply the point I'm trying to get across. So it's not that every member of staff who is directed at public inquiry at the moment would be in a court prosecuting tomorrow. They wouldn't.
They may have delayed the prosecution of other cases, for example.
They would be doing other work. They would be helping to clear the backlogs that we've got.
Right. Okay, that's fine. Reading between the lines there a wee bit, actually, as I'm sure colleagues are. Just one further question to yourself, Mr Kennedy. You've said in the very last sentence of the second last paragraph, reform is not optional, it is essential. So anything you wish to add to that?
I just believe it's absolutely essential. Otherwise, we keep going through this revolving door. We know the public finances are not great within in the UK, and the Barnett formula that we obviously get in Scotland is a direct consequence of that. So we have to look at reform. We have to look at ways that we can minimise this spend to assist. And I don't think it is. I think it has to take place. Otherwise, you'll be somebody else who's maybe not me will be sitting here in years to come answering the same questions.
Okay, so just to wind up the session then, is there any aspect of this which we haven't touched on that you would like to make any points on, either of you, Mr McGowan? Is there anything you feel you want to convey to the committee? Mr Kennedy, anything else you would like to convey to your committee?
No, thank you. Just glad if we can help. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, I want to thank both of you for your evidence this morning. It's been extremely helpful in terms of our inquiry, and we will continue to take further evidence next week. You'll be glad, incidentally, we'll be reporting on this sometime in the autumn, not in the year 2038 or anything like that. We move much more swiftly, certainly, on this committee. So the next item on our agenda, which should be taken in private, is consideration of our work programme. So we'll now move into private. So I'll just call a 2-minute break to allow our guests and broadcasting and official report to leave. Thank you.